My name is Vanessa. I am 33 years old, and until recently I actually believed my family was capable of changing. At my graduation party, my dad made a toast not to me, but to my younger sister. He looked right past my cap and gown and said, "I wish it was you holding that diploma. You are the only child who has ever truly made me proud." My mom nodded in agreement, while my own husband laughed. No one noticed when I left quietly. But what happened next shocked everyone and destroyed the fake empire they spent years building. If you have ever been the family scapegoat who had to stand up for yourself, take a moment to tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see exactly how I made them pay for every single betrayal. The clinking of fine crystal echoed through the rented hall of the Chicago Country Club. I stood near the back corner, feeling the heavy fabric of my graduation gown clinging to my shoulders. The room was filled with soft jazz and the chatter of 50 guests enjoying an open bar. After 4 grueling years of night classes balancing a demanding full-time job with endless exams and complex coding projects, I had finally earned my Master of Science in Computer Science. This dinner was supposed to be my celebration. I had paid for the catering, the venue, and the decorations entirely by myself, hoping just this once my family might acknowledge my hard work. My father Richard stood at the head of the main table and cleared his throat. I felt a rare, foolish flicker of hope. He raised his glass of expensive champagne, and the room fell silent. But his eyes did not find me. They bypassed the corner where I stood entirely and landed squarely on my 29-year-old sister, Brittany. Brittany sat in the center of the room, soaking up the attention. She was wearing a shimmering designer dress that cost more than my first car. She was currently unemployed, having quit her 3rd job this year because she found the morning commute too demanding for her mental health. Yet she looked at my father with the radiant expectation of a queen waiting for her crown. Richard raised his glass higher. To Brittany, he announced, his voice booming across the quiet room. "I want to take a moment to celebrate unmatched potential. I look at you, and I see the future of this family. I wish it was you holding that diploma today. You are the only child who has ever truly made me proud." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs. I looked around the room, hoping someone, anyone, would register the absolute cruelty of what had just been said. My mother, Patricia, simply smiled and nodded, her perfectly styled hair catching the light as she beamed at her golden child. She raised her own glass in agreement. It was a familiar dynamic playing out on what was supposed to be my milestone. Growing up, I was the one fixing the household computers, doing the chores, and bringing home flawless report cards, while Brittany was showered with expensive pageants, brand new cars, and endless praise. When I bought my own modest house, Patricia complained that the neighborhood was not prestigious enough. When Brittany rented a luxury apartment she could not afford, Patricia co-signed the lease without hesitation. I had foolishly thought a master's degree might finally balance the scales. Richard was not finished. He chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "Let us be honest," he continued, addressing the crowd. "A computer degree is a waste of time for a glorified IT desk worker. But Brittany here, she has the vision to build a real empire." My cheeks burned with intense humiliation. I had spent countless nights drinking stale coffee, staring at lines of code until my eyes blurred, trying to secure a better future. And in one sentence, my own father had reduced my exhaustion and triumph to a meaningless joke. The guests murmured politely, unsure of how to react, but unwilling to cross a wealthy man like Richard. I swallowed hard, fighting the thick lump forming in my throat. I turned my head to look at my husband Kevin, standing just a few feet away. We had been married for 4 years, and he knew exactly how much this degree meant to me. He had seen the tears, the stress, and the sheer willpower it took to finish the program. I expected him to step forward to put a protective arm around my waist, or at least offer a sympathetic glance. Instead, Kevin stepped away from me and walked directly toward Brittany. A broad grin stretched across his face as he reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a small black velvet box. My breath hitched. He had not brought me a single flower today. He had not even offered a card to congratulate me on graduating. Kevin handed the velvet box to my sister. To the real star of the family, Kevin declared, his voice projecting clearly across the room. Good luck with the new lifestyle brand, Brit. We all know you are going to take the world by storm. Brittany let out a high-pitched squeal of delight and popped the box open, revealing a glittering diamond tennis bracelet. She threw her arms around my husband, hugging him tightly. Oh, Kevin, you should not have, she gushed, though her smug expression made it clear she absolutely expected it. My own husband had bought expensive jewelry for my unemployed sister to celebrate a lifestyle brand that did not even have a business plan yet, while standing at a party I paid for to celebrate my graduation. The betrayal was so precise and so public that for a few seconds the room seemed to spin. I watched them laughing together. Kevin, Brittany, my father, and my mother. A perfect circle of mutual admiration that intentionally locked me out. I could feel the familiar stinging behind my eyes, warning me that tears were coming. That was exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to cause a scene, to cry, to storm off angrily so they could call me unstable and dramatic. They wanted to prove their narrative that I was just the bitter, jealous older sister who could not handle Brittany shining. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I took a deep, steadying breath and forced the tears down. I smoothed the front of my graduation gown and placed my untouched glass of champagne on a passing waiter's tray. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slipped it into the waiter's hand. Thank you for your service tonight, I said, my voice perfectly calm and even. Enjoy the rest of your shift. Without looking back at the main table, without making a single sound, I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. I pushed them open and stepped out into the freezing Chicago rain. The cold air hit my face, instantly cooling the heat in my cheeks. No one called my name. No one rushed out to stop me. My absence meant absolutely nothing to them. I walked to my car, the wet pavement reflecting the streetlights like shattered glass. I drove back to the modest suburban home I had purchased with my own savings before I even met Kevin. The house was quiet and dark, perfectly matching the hollow feeling in my chest. I did not want to stay here tonight. I could not bear the thought of Kevin returning from the party, smelling of expensive champagne and acting as if nothing had happened. I resolved to pack a small bag and book a room at a hotel downtown, just to get some space and figure out my next move. I walked into the home office we shared to grab my laptop charger. The room was messy, with Kevin's paperwork scattered across his side of the desk. As I reached over his chair to grab my cord, my elbow brushed a stack of mail, knocking a few envelopes to the floor. I bent down to pick them up. One envelope caught my eye. It was from our bank, marked urgent and unsealed. I frowned, pulling the folded document out. My eyes scanned the harsh black text printed on the official letterhead. It was a notice of default. The words blurred for a moment before snapping into sharp, terrifying focus. The bank was notifying us of severe delinquency on a $250,000 second mortgage taken out against this house. My heart slammed against my ribs. A second mortgage. I had never authorized a loan on this property. I owned this house outright, having paid off the primary mortgage 2 years ago by working double shifts and living frugally. I sank into Kevin's desk chair, my hands trembling as I read through the details. The loan had been finalized 3 months ago. The funds had been transferred to a business account I did not recognize. I flipped to the second page to see the signature line. There, in plain blue ink, was my name, perfectly mimicking my handwriting, right next to Kevin's signature. He had forged my name. He had pulled $250,000 of equity out of my home without my knowledge. The crushing weight of the night's humiliation suddenly vanished, replaced by a rising tide of pure cold adrenaline. My husband had not just humiliated me, he had stolen from me. The front door rattled violently against its frame before swinging wide open. Kevin stumbled into the foyer, bringing a sudden gust of freezing Chicago rain with him. He carelessly kicked off his leather dress shoes, the heavy thud echoing through the quiet house. He was humming a cheerful, off-key tune, reeking of expensive scotch and the cloying, sweet floral perfume that I now realized belonged to my sister Brittany. He did not even flinch when he finally looked up, and saw me standing in the hallway, still wearing my damp graduation gown, holding the unsealed bank document in my hand. He casually loosened his silk tie and smirked. He asked if I enjoyed my dramatic little exit from the country club. He said I always had a terrible habit of ruining a good party with my sour mood, and that my father was right to focus his toast on someone who actually knew how to celebrate. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I simply lifted my arm and threw the bank notice directly at his chest. The thick paper fluttered to the hardwood floor, landing right beside his discarded shoes. I told him to explain why the bank was notifying me of a severe default on a $250,000 second mortgage. I demanded to know how a massive loan was taken out against the home I bought with my own savings without my knowledge or consent. Kevin did not even bother to look down at the document. He let out a loud, genuine laugh, shaking his head as if I were a child asking a foolish question. He walked past me into the kitchen, opening the refrigerator to grab a bottle of sparkling water. He took a long drink before turning back to face me, leaning casually against the expensive granite countertop that I had paid to install. He said he needed liquid capital. He explained that a visionary like Brittany could not possibly launch a luxury lifestyle brand on pocket change. He told me that her angel investors wanted to see initial seed money for her curated yoga retreats and artisanal home goods, and my boring little savings account was entirely tied up in this suffocating suburban house. So he took the initiative. He forged my signature on the loan documents, bypassed the standard notary checks using a corrupt friend at his firm, and wired the entire $250,000 directly into Brittany's new business account. I stared at him, letting the absolute magnitude of his confession sink in. He felt no remorse. He felt completely justified in stealing my hard-earned money to fund a vanity project for a woman who had never worked a real job in her life. I bought this house with the money I saved from working 3 jobs during my undergraduate years. Every brick, every shingle, every fixture was paid for by my sweat. I asked him how he could possibly justify robbing his own wife to fund her spoiled sister. Kevin smiled, a cold and calculated expression that instantly stripped away the last 4 years of our marriage. He reached into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times. He held the device up to my face. The bright screen displayed a text message thread with Brittany. The most recent message was sent just 20 minutes ago. It read, "Tonight was perfect. Did the desk jockey suspect anything about the money? I cannot wait to celebrate properly later." My stomach twisted violently, but I kept my face entirely blank. Kevin pocketed the phone and crossed his arms over his chest. He admitted they had been sleeping together for 1.5 years. He said it started right around the time I took on my heaviest course load for my master's degree. He called me a boring, work-obsessed loser who spent every evening staring at lines of code or reading dry textbooks instead of entertaining him. He said a man of his stature needed a woman with glamour, someone who understood how to shine in high society, someone who did not smell like stale coffee and utter exhaustion. He said Brittany was a star, and I was just the dull background noise they had to tolerate until her startup was fully funded. I asked him if my entire marriage was just a financial stepping stone for his affair. Kevin shrugged, completely unfazed by the question. He said I was a reliable safety net, but safety nets were meant to be stepped on. He told me I lacked the ambition to ever be anything more than a mid-level IT desk worker. He laughed again, pointing at my graduation gown, calling it a tragic costume for a woman who would spend the rest of her life fixing broken routers for ungrateful executives. I did not break down. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing a single tear fall. I told him I wanted him out of my house immediately. I told him to pack his bags and go stay with Brittany because I was calling the police in the morning to report the forged loan documents and his massive financial fraud. Kevin's smile vanished in an instant. His eyes darkened with a sudden vicious intensity. He pushed away from the counter and closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He grabbed me by the arm, his grip tight enough to bruise my skin, and shoved me toward the hallway closet. He yanked the door open, grabbed the small suitcase I had packed earlier when I intended to escape to a hotel, and threw it roughly against my legs. He told me I was not calling anyone, and I certainly was not kicking him out. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my face. He asked if I remembered the thick stack of state tax forms he brought home 3 months ago. He reminded me how he had rushed into my home office while I was frantically studying for my final exams, demanding I sign the paperwork immediately because his accountant was waiting and the deadline was hours away. I remembered clearly. I had trusted my husband. I had quickly signed the pages marked with bright sticky notes without pausing to read the microscopic fine print. Kevin smiled a cruel, triumphant smile. He revealed that slipped perfectly between those mundane tax documents was a quitclaim deed. I had legally signed away all my rights to the property. He had filed the paperwork the very next morning with the county clerk. The house I had saved for the house I had painstakingly decorated and maintained now belonged entirely and legally to him. I was simply a guest, and my welcome had just expired. He grabbed my shoulder and physically shoved me toward the front door. He yanked the heavy oak door open, revealing the freezing torrential Chicago rain pouring down on the front porch. The wind howled loudly, sending icy sheets of water blowing into the entryway and soaking the floorboards. Kevin kicked my suitcase out onto the wet concrete. He looked me up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust. He told me to get off his property before he called the police and reported me for trespassing. He said failures did not belong in his house and I was the biggest failure he had ever met. He slammed the door shut and the heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a loud final thud. I stood alone on the front porch, the freezing rain instantly soaking through my graduation gown. The water plastered my hair to my face and seeped deep into my shoes. I looked at the locked door of the house I had bought, the house that had just been stolen from me by the man I loved, all to fund the sister who actively despised me. Any other woman might have collapsed onto the wet concrete. Any other woman might have pounded their fists on the door, screaming and sobbing, begging for her husband to show some mercy and let her back in from the storm. But I was not any other woman. I slowly reached up and wiped the cold rain from my eyes. I smoothed the wet lapels of my gown. I reached into my clutch, which I had kept firmly gripped in my hand throughout the entire ordeal, and pulled out my secondary mobile device. It was not the cheap, outdated smartphone my family saw me use every day. It was a highly customized, encrypted satellite phone. I dialed a private, unlisted number. The line rang exactly once before a sharp, professional voice answered on the other end. I gave a brief, coded authorization phrase. I told the voice my exact coordinates and said I needed immediate extraction. I stood in the freezing downpour for exactly 2 minutes. I did not shiver. I did not look back at the stolen house. I simply watched the dark street ahead, my mind racing with cold, precise calculations. Right on time, a sleek, armored black town car glided silently around the corner and pulled to a smooth stop directly in front of my driveway. The bright headlights cut easily through the heavy rain. A man in a sharp black suit immediately stepped out holding a large umbrella. He rushed up the driveway, shielding me from the storm, and respectfully picked up my soaked suitcase. He opened the rear door of the town car, gesturing politely for me to enter. I slid into the spacious, heated leather interior. The driver closed the door securely behind me, shutting out the storm and the noise completely. He settled into the driver's seat and looked at me through the rearview mirror, waiting silently for his instructions. I looked out the tinted window at the dark suburban house one last time. Kevin and Brittany thought they had just destroyed a pathetic mid-level IT desk worker. They thought they had drained my only savings and left me utterly destitute on the street. They had absolutely no idea who they had just declared war on. "Take me to the downtown penthouse," I told the driver, my voice ringing with absolute authority. The car accelerated smoothly into the night. I leaned back against the plush leather seat and let out a long, slow breath. I was not a broke IT worker. I was a multi-millionaire, and I was about to systematically dismantle every single piece of their stolen, pathetic lives. The town car pulled up to the private entrance of the tallest, most exclusive residential skyscraper in Chicago's Gold Coast district. The uniformed concierge stepped out immediately, holding a large umbrella to shield me from the freezing downpour. He greeted me with a respectful nod, completely unbothered by my damp hair and ruined clothes. I bypassed the main lobby and stepped directly into the private, biometric-secured elevator. I pressed my thumb against the glass scanner. The elevator silently shot upward, climbing 50 floors above the city streets. The steel doors slid open, revealing my sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the Chicago skyline, the glittering city lights reflecting against the rain-slicked glass. This was my true home. For the past 6 years, I had maintained the ultimate disguise. To my husband, my parents, and my insufferable sister, I was just Vanessa, the boring mid-level tech support worker. I let them believe I spent my days resetting passwords and fixing jammed printers. I let them mock my modest salary and my plain clothes. In reality, I was the founder and CEO of Sentinel Vanguard, a premier, highly classified cybersecurity firm. I built my company from the ground up, securing lucrative contracts with federal agencies and multinational banks. I was a multimillionaire many times over. I deliberately kept my wealth strictly hidden because I knew exactly who my family was. I knew that if my status-obsessed mother or my greedy father ever discovered I possessed a 9-figure net worth, they would descend upon me like vultures. They would demand investments, loans, and lifestyle upgrades, draining me dry while taking credit for my success. My drab, boring IT persona was my armor. Kevin thought he had successfully manipulated a naive desk worker, entirely unaware that he had just declared war on one of the most dangerous digital forensic experts in the country. I walked into the foyer and stripped off the wet, heavy graduation gown, letting it drop carelessly onto the pristine Italian marble floor. I kicked off my ruined shoes and walked barefoot down the long hallway, heading straight for my command center. I unlocked the reinforced steel door and stepped into the climate-controlled server room. A massive curved desk sat in the center, supporting a formidable array of 6 high-definition monitors linked to a proprietary military-grade server rack. Fueled by a cold surgical rage, I dropped into my leather executive chair and powered up the workstation. The screens flared to life simultaneously, casting an icy blue glow across the dark room. I cracked my knuckles and began typing. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced speed. I was not going to sit in a hotel room and cry. I was not going to hire a standard divorce attorney and fight over a stolen house. I was going to legally, financially, and completely annihilate them. I initiated my firm's proprietary forensic tracking software. It was a tool I personally designed to hunt down international cybercriminals and trace illicit funds through the darkest, most obscured layers of the internet. Tonight, I was pointing that devastating weapon directly at my own family. I started with Kevin. I accessed the local bank's mainframe, slicing through their basic commercial security firewalls in less than 40 seconds. I pulled up the records for the forged $250,000 second mortgage. I watched the digital trail as the money flowed out of my home equity and landed directly into a newly minted business account registered to Britney's fake luxury lifestyle brand. But as my software scraped Kevin's personal devices and cloud storage, an alert flashed red across my center monitor. The program flagged a massive recurring data anomaly. It showed a highly encrypted continuous data stream linking Kevin's personal laptop IP address directly to the private internal servers of my father's prestigious investment firm. I leaned closer to the monitors, my eyes narrowing. Richard had always bragged about his elite corporate security, mocking my career by claiming his firm hired only the best technological minds. I bypassed his supposedly impenetrable corporate firewalls in under 3 minutes. I dove headfirst into the master financial records of Richard's company. I bypassed the public-facing ledgers and dug straight down into the raw, unedited transaction logs. What I found made my blood run ice cold. The reality of my family's wealth was a horrifying illusion. Richard's entire financial empire was a complete mirage. He was not a brilliant investor. He was running a massive, highly sophisticated embezzlement ring. I watched the data flow across my screens, mapping out the theft in real time. For the past 4 years, Richard had been systematically siphoning money out of the pension funds of his working-class clients. He was stealing the hard-earned retirement savings of teachers, construction workers, and nurses. Every time a client deposited funds for their future, Richard skimmed a heavy percentage right off the top. He was funneling millions of stolen dollars into offshore shell companies, using that stolen cash to finance Britney's extravagant lifestyle pay for Patricia's country club memberships and keep his own failing business afloat. He was bleeding innocent people dry so his golden child could buy designer handbags and diamond tennis bracelets. I dug deeper, tracing the specific mechanism of the theft. The stolen funds were being routed through dozens of dummy accounts, masked by a complex, constantly shifting algorithm. The code was designed to alter the ledger balances, automatically creating fake temporary gains to mask the missing funds, just long enough to avoid triggering federal banking audits. I pulled up the source code for the algorithm and recognized the signature coding style instantly. It was Kevin. My husband, the man who had just laughed in my face and shoved me out into the freezing rain, was the architect of the malware. He had written the exact program Richard used to hide his federal crimes. Kevin and Richard were not just arrogant, greedy bullies. They were co-conspirators in a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud syndicate. Kevin thought he was a genius for stealing $250,000 from my house, entirely oblivious to the fact that he had left a glowing digital trail of federal crimes right to his own doorstep. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The sheer scale of their depravity was staggering. They had ruined the lives of hundreds of innocent families just to maintain their pathetic facade of high society wealth. I began compiling every single ledger, every hidden transaction, and every line of Kevin's malicious code. I bundled the evidence into a highly encrypted, heavily guarded digital vault on my secure server. I was building a guillotine, and I was going to make sure the blade was perfectly sharp before I dropped it. As my automated scraping tool finished downloading the last of Richard's corporate emails, a secondary alert chimed from the right side monitor. My program had detected a hidden, deeply buried subserver partitioned off from Richard's main network. It was heavily encrypted, far beyond the standard financial protections he used for his firm. My curiosity piqued. I focused my attention on the hidden server, deploying a brute force decryption key to shatter the digital lock. The folder snapped open, revealing a single highly classified directory. I clicked on the directory and my heart completely stopped. It was an official, legally binding trust fund document. The name at the top of the ledger was mine in bold black letters, Vanessa Wilson. The document showed that the trust had been established nearly 15 years ago by my late grandfather, the only person in my family who had ever showed me genuine kindness. He had left the trust entirely in my name, appointing my parents as the executors until I turned 30. My grandfather had always seen past Patricia and Richard's shallow vanity. He had recognized my quiet dedication and wanted to ensure I would never be beholden to their manipulative control. The original deposit amount, listed on the establishment document, was $4 million. My grandfather had left me $4 million to ensure my future was safe and secure. I had spent years working multiple grueling jobs, eating cheap noodles, and losing sleep over utility bills, completely unaware that I was a multimillionaire by birthright. I quickly scrolled down to the bottom of the long, detailed ledger, my eyes frantically searching for the current financial summary. The final line of the encrypted document glared back at me with devastating, undeniable clarity. Current balance $0. I stared at the zero balance until the numbers burned into my retinas. $4 million vanished into thin air. I did not blink. I did not scream. I routed my tracking software directly into the trust's historical ledger, commanding the system to unearth every single withdrawal, every wire transfer, every cleared check, and every administrative fee over the past 15 years. The screen flooded with cascading lines of financial data. I isolated the primary recipient account, receiving the largest and most frequent disbursements. The routing number belonged to a private elite wealth management bank located in downtown Boston. The account holder name flashed on my screen in bright white letters: Patricia Wilson, my mother. The exact date of the very first massive withdrawal hit me like a physical strike. It was exactly 2 days after my 18th birthday. A sharp, fast-paced memory ripped through my mind, playing out with brutal clarity. I was standing in the immaculate kitchen of my childhood home. Patricia was tapping her manicured fingernails against the granite island, her face pulled into a tight frown of supreme impatience. She demanded my social security card and my state driver's license. She shoved a thick, dense stack of legal documents across the counter, completely covering the financial details with her hands exposing only the bottom signature lines. She told me it was for my college financial aid applications. She said I needed to sign them immediately because the deadlines were closing. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and said, "You do not want to be a financial burden on your poor father, do you, Vanessa? You need to sign these now so we can secure your loans and keep the family finances secure." I signed them instantly. I handed over my identification, desperate to please her, desperate to prove I was a responsible daughter. Patricia had never applied for financial aid on my behalf. I had paid for every single credit hour of my undergraduate and graduate degrees by working graveyard shifts at a diner and running campus tech support. Patricia had used my social security number to completely forge my identity. She had legally appointed herself the sole proxy and beneficiary manager of my grandfather's trust. Over the next decade, she systematically bled my safety net completely dry. She stole my future to fund Brittany's lavish European vacations, her custom designer wardrobes, and her endless string of failed expensive hobbies. My mother had looked me in the eye, told me I was a financial burden, and then robbed me blind. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal settled heavily over my shoulders. My husband, my father, my mother, and my sister. They were all parasites feeding off my hard work and my stolen legacy. I felt the last, lingering shred of familial loyalty burn away into ash, leaving behind nothing but cold, calculating rage. I turned my attention back to the 6 monitors illuminating my face. I was not going to scream or cry or confront them with tearful accusations. I was going to use my digital arsenal to destroy their reality. I targeted Richard's hidden offshore accounts. I used the proprietary infiltration tools I had personally built to track international cyber syndicates and dismantle financial terror networks. Richard thought his wealth was perfectly hidden behind impenetrable Swiss and Cayman Island banking firewalls. He thought his money laundering was secure. I sliced through his outdated security protocols in less than 12 minutes. I bypassed the dual authentication servers and planted myself directly inside the root directory of his master financial network. I did not drain the accounts. That would be far too fast, far too merciful. If the money vanished tonight, they would panic and scramble to hide their remaining physical assets. I wanted them to feel entirely secure. I wanted them to believe they had won the war. Instead, I injected a highly sophisticated sleeper protocol into the core architecture of his banking network. It was a stealth lockdown sequence designed to mimic normal server activity until the exact moment of execution. I programmed a delayed absolute trigger. In exactly 7 days, at the precise moment Richard usually logged in to review his morning portfolio, the sleeper protocol would activate. It would simultaneously freeze every single account tied to his name, his firm, and his numerous shell companies. It would lock down his credit lines, cancel his wire privileges, revoke his firm's trading licenses, and automatically forward a comprehensive, undeletable ledger of his embezzlement activities directly to the fraud division of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service. For the next week, Richard and Patricia would continue living their luxurious stolen lives, completely oblivious to the digital time bomb ticking down under their feet. They would sleep soundly before losing absolutely everything. The harsh vibration of my burner phone shattered the quiet hum of the server room. I glanced at the glowing screen resting on my mahogany desk. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, masking my righteous anger behind a wall of absolute detachment. I picked up the device and pressed answer. Patricia did not bother with a greeting. Her voice was shrill, dripping with condescension and aggressive authority. "You made a complete fool of yourself tonight, Vanessa," she snapped, "leaving your own graduation party like a petulant child. It was highly embarrassing for your father and me. We had to tell our important guests you were feeling unwell just to cover up your dramatic little exit. You always find a way to ruin a perfectly good evening with your terrible attitude. I remained perfectly silent, letting her toxic words hang in the air. My silence only fueled her irritation. She continued her tirade, demanding my presence at a mandatory family dinner tomorrow evening at their exclusive country club. She informed me that the entire family would be seated at the VIP table in the main dining room at 7 o'clock sharp. Brittany has a huge announcement to make, Patricia insisted, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. It is incredibly important for her new luxury brand and her future with Kevin. You are going to be there. You are going to dress appropriately for once in your life, and you are going to smile. Before the main course arrives, you will stand up and apologize to your sister and your father for ruining the mood tonight. You owe them that much respect after everything they have done for you. I stared at the monitors displaying the digital evidence of her massive theft. She wanted me to apologize. She wanted me to beg for forgiveness from the people who had stolen my home and drained my $4 million trust fund. I kept my voice deadpan, completely stripped of any emotion. I told her I understood the instructions. I told her I would absolutely be there tomorrow night. I said I would not miss Brittany's huge announcement for the world. Patricia let out a sharp sigh of approval, muttered something about me finally showing some maturity, and hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I placed the burner phone face down on the desk. The trap was set. They wanted a family dinner, and I was going to serve them a feast of devastating consequences. I reached for my coffee mug, ready to begin compiling the legal documents I needed for tomorrow. Suddenly, the main monitor in the center of my workstation flashed a blinding, pulsing crimson warning. The room was bathed in red light. A high-pitched alarm echoed from my encrypted speakers. Intrusion alert. A massive, aggressive, brute-force data breach attempt was hammering against the outer firewalls of Sentinel Vanguard's highly classified corporate servers. Someone was launching a coordinated high-level attack, trying to crack into my company's main client database to steal proprietary information. My fingers slammed onto the keyboard, instantly initiating my active defense protocols. I deployed a digital sandbox, a secure, isolated server environment designed to trap the incoming malware and trace its origin without letting the attacker realize they had been caught. I isolated the attacking signal. The hacker was using a series of clumsy, outdated proxy servers to mask their location, bouncing the signal through compromised servers in Russia and Brazil. My software chewed through the weak encryption, stripping away the fake proxies in a matter of seconds. I ran a rapid, aggressive trace on the true origin IP address. The geographic location pinged on my digital map, narrowing down from the state of Illinois to the city of Chicago, and finally zooming in on a very specific suburban neighborhood. The system pulled the exact MAC address and the device registry information. I stared at the results flashing on the screen. The attack was originating directly from my old suburban address. The registered device was a high-end gaming laptop. It was Kevin's laptop. My husband, sitting in the living room of the house he had just stolen from me, was actively trying to hack into the multi-million-dollar cybersecurity firm that I secretly owned. I watched the red alert flashing across my center monitor. Kevin was actively trying to breach Sentinel Vanguard. My husband, sitting in the living room of the house he had just stolen from me, was launching a brute force attack using amateur clumsy scripts he had likely purchased on the dark web. He was trying to hack into my servers to steal my client list, completely unaware that he was attacking his own wife. I did not panic. I simply typed a few commands, isolated his IP address, and fed his system a continuous loop of fabricated encrypted garbage data to keep him occupied. I locked my workstation and stepped away. I had a family dinner to attend, and I needed to look the part of a broken, defeated woman. I bypassed my closet of tailored designer suits and selected a faded, shapeless gray dress. I scraped my hair back into a tight, severe bun and washed my face completely clean of makeup. I wanted to look exactly like the pathetic, exhausted, mid-level IT worker they all believed I was. Driving to the Oakwood Country Club, I focused my mind, burying my cold rage beneath a mask of absolute submission. When I walked through the grand double doors of the main dining room, the crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the wealthy patrons. The maitre d' led me to a secluded VIP table in the back alcove. My family was already seated, looking like a portrait of high society. Richard wore a custom Italian suit swirling amber scotch in his crystal glass. Patricia sat perfectly poised, adjusting her diamond necklace. Brittany and Kevin sat pressed tightly together, whispering and laughing over a plate of oysters. Kevin looked up, and his smirk widened into a cruel grin when he saw my drab appearance. I pulled out my own chair and sat down. No one offered a greeting. Brittany did not waste a single second. She immediately slammed her hand flat on the white tablecloth. She held up her left hand aggressively, waving a massive, gaudy diamond engagement ring right in my face. She announced in a loud, victorious tone that she and Kevin were officially engaged. She rubbed her perfectly flat stomach and declared that she was already 8 weeks pregnant with his child. She leaned across the table, her eyes glittering with malice, and said they were finally starting the family that I was too selfish, cold, and career-obsessed to give him. I forced my breathing to hitch. I dropped my gaze to my lap, letting my shoulders slump forward. I channeled every ounce of the profound disgust I felt into a physical performance of absolute heartbreak. Kevin leaned back in his chair and laughed, telling me I should be happy for them since I was clearly incapable of maintaining a real relationship anyway. Richard cleared his throat loudly, instantly commanding the attention of the table. He said my jealousy was exhausting, and it was time to finalize the business between us so they could move on with their lives. He reached into his expensive leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slid the papers across the table, stopping them right in front of my empty dinner plate. I asked what they were, forcing my voice to tremble slightly. Richard explained that Kevin had generously decided not to pursue alimony considering my meager, pathetic salary. However, Richard said his accountants had run a background check and found a limited liability company registered in my name. He laughed a deep, booming laugh, calling it a cute little tech consulting hustle. He demanded I sign full legal ownership of the LLC over to Kevin to compensate him for the severe emotional distress of our marriage. But the extortion did not stop there. Richard pointed a thick, heavy finger directly at my chest. He said Brittany and Kevin deserved the society wedding of the decade, an event fitting for the golden child of the family. Since I had supposedly hoarded my money and lived like a selfish pauper for years, Richard demanded I take out a personal loan for $100,000 to pay for their catering and the luxury venue. He told me it was my absolute duty as the older sister to fund her happiness, especially after I had embarrassed the family so profoundly by walking out of my own graduation party. I stared at the contract, maintaining my facade of a terrified, cornered animal. I whispered that $100,000 would ruin my credit forever, that I could not possibly afford the monthly payments on a basic IT salary, and that my tiny LLC was my only source of emergency income. Patricia leaned across the table. Her smile was incredibly sweet, but her words were pure, unadulterated venom. She reached out and patted my hand, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. She told me I did not have a choice in the matter. She said if I refused to sign the documents and secure the loan by tomorrow afternoon, Kevin was prepared to file a massive, highly publicized civil lawsuit against me. Patricia calmly explained that Kevin would publicly claim I had been physically and emotionally abusive for the entirety of our marriage. He would tell the courts that my work obsession had driven me to manic, violent outbursts. She smiled wider, her eyes gleaming, and added that no judge in the city would ever doubt the word of a successful, charming man over a bitter, jealous, unstable spinster. Richard leaned in to finish the threat. He reminded me of his vast corporate network across the entire city of Chicago. He promised that if I did not comply with their demands immediately, he would personally make calls to the executive boards of every tech firm in the state. He swore he would ruin my professional reputation so thoroughly that I would not even be able to get a job fixing printers at a local public library. He told me I would be rendered completely destitute, permanently unemployable, and tied up in endless, draining litigation until I was bankrupt and living on the streets. They sat back in their chairs, crossing their arms in unison, presenting a united front of pure malice. They genuinely believed they had trapped a helpless mouse. They had no idea they were sitting in a locked cage with a lion. I let my lower lip tremble violently. I forced moisture into my eyes, letting a single pathetic tear slide down my cheek. I buried my face in my hands and let out a loud, broken sob. I begged them not to ruin my life. I cried that I was incredibly sorry for being such a disappointment, sorry for neglecting Kevin, and sorry for ruining the graduation party with my bad attitude. I looked directly at Brittany with wide, tear-filled eyes and told her I just wanted to be part of this family again. I told them I would do whatever they wanted. I promised to sign over the LLC immediately and go to the bank the very next morning to secure the $100,000 cashier check. Kevin laughed aloud, calling me pathetic and weak. Richard pushed an expensive fountain pen across the table, demanding I sign the papers right then and there. I stopped him, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand, feigning total surrender. I told them I would give them everything they asked for, but I had one single condition. I sniffled loudly and looked at Patricia. I said I wanted to prove to everyone that I was a supportive sister and that there was no bad blood between us. I requested permission to attend their massive engagement gala on Saturday night. I promised to stand up on stage in front of all their wealthy friends, corporate investors, and society elites, and present the signed LLC transfer documents and the $100,000 check as a grand public gift of forgiveness and blessing for their union. Pure, unfiltered greed instantly washed over their faces. The idea of humiliating me publicly, forcing me to bow down to Brittany in front of hundreds of people, while simultaneously cashing my massive check, was a temptation far too sweet for them to resist. Patricia smiled brightly, her eyes flashing with cruel delight, declaring it a wonderfully mature idea. Richard nodded his approval, telling me to make sure I bought a decent dress so I did not embarrass them in front of his important clients. They bought my performance completely arrogant in their assumed victory. I lowered my head submissively, staring down at my lap, but beneath the table my hands were perfectly steady. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted a show. I was going to give them a grand execution. I stared at the zero balance until the glowing digits burned into my retinas. $4 million of fortune meant to guarantee my independence completely vanished into thin air. I did not scream. I did not shatter the monitors. I simply routed my forensic tracking software directly into the trust fund's historical ledger, commanding the system to unearth every single withdrawal, every wire transfer, and every cleared check over the past 14 years. The screen flooded with cascading lines of financial data. I isolated the primary recipient account, receiving the largest, most frequent disbursements. The routing number belonged to a private elite wealth management bank located in downtown Chicago. The account holder name flashed on my screen in bright white letters. It was Patricia, my mother. The exact date of the very first massive withdrawal hit me like a physical strike. It was processed exactly 2 days after my 18th birthday. A sharp, fast-paced memory ripped through my mind, playing out with brutal, sickening clarity. I was standing in the immaculate kitchen of my childhood home, clutching a stack of college brochures. Patricia was tapping her manicured fingernails against the granite island, her face pulled into a tight frown of supreme impatience. She demanded my social security card and my newly issued state driver's license. She shoved a thick, dense stack of legal documents across the counter, completely covering the financial details with her hands, exposing only the bottom signature lines. She told me it was for my college financial aid applications. She said I needed to sign them immediately because the federal deadlines were closing. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and said, I did not want to be a financial burden on my poor father, and I needed to sign the papers to secure my student loans. I signed them instantly. I handed over my identification, desperate to please her, desperate to prove I was a responsible, grateful daughter. Patricia had never applied for financial aid on my behalf. I had paid for every single credit hour of my undergraduate and master's degrees by working graveyard shifts at a diner and running campus tech support until my hands cramped. Patricia had used my social security number and my signature to completely forge my identity. She had legally appointed herself the sole proxy and beneficiary manager of my grandfather's trust. Over the next decade, she systematically bled my safety net completely dry. She stole my future to fund Brittany's lavish European vacations, her custom designer wardrobes, and her endless string of failed expensive startup hobbies. She used my inheritance to pay for her exclusive country club memberships and luxury vehicles. My mother had looked me in the eye, called me a financial burden, and then robbed me blind. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal settled heavily over my shoulders. My husband, my father, my mother, and my sister. They were all parasites feeding off my hard work and my stolen legacy. I felt the last lingering shred of familial loyalty burn away into ash, leaving behind nothing but cold, calculating rage. I turned my attention back to the 6 monitors illuminating my face. I was not going to hire a standard divorce attorney and fight over a stolen house. I was going to use my digital arsenal to systematically dismantle their reality. I targeted Richard's hidden offshore accounts first. I used the proprietary infiltration tools I had personally built to track international cyber syndicates and dismantle financial terror networks. Richard thought his wealth was perfectly hidden behind impenetrable Swiss and Cayman Island banking firewalls. He thought his money laundering was secure. I sliced through his outdated security protocols in less than 12 minutes. I bypassed the dual authentication servers and planted myself directly inside the root directory of his master financial network. I could have drained the accounts entirely with a single keystroke. I could have transferred every stolen cent into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. But that would be far too fast, far too merciful. If the money vanished tonight, they would panic and scramble to hide their remaining physical assets. I wanted them to feel entirely secure. I wanted them to believe they had won the war. Instead, I injected a highly sophisticated sleeper protocol into the core architecture of his banking network. It was a stealth lockdown sequence designed to mimic normal server activity until the exact moment of execution. I programmed a delayed absolute trigger. In exactly 7 days at the precise moment Richard usually logged in to review his morning portfolio, the sleeper protocol would activate. It would simultaneously freeze every single account tied to his name, his firm, and his numerous shell companies. It would lock down his credit lines, cancel his wire privileges, revoke his firm's trading licenses, and automatically forward a comprehensive, undeletable ledger of his embezzlement activities directly to the Fraud Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For the next week, Richard and Patricia would continue living their luxurious stolen lives, completely oblivious to the digital time bomb ticking down under their feet. They would sleep soundly before losing absolutely everything. The harsh vibration of my burner phone shattered the quiet hum of the server room. I glanced at the glowing screen resting on my mahogany desk. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, masking my righteous anger behind a wall of absolute detachment. I picked up the device and pressed answer. Patricia did not bother with a greeting. Her voice was shrill, dripping with condescension and aggressive authority. "You made a complete fool of yourself tonight, Vanessa," she snapped, "leaving your own graduation party like a petulant child. It was highly embarrassing for your father and me. We had to tell our important guests you were feeling unwell just to cover up your dramatic little exit. You always find a way to ruin a perfectly good evening with your terrible attitude." I remained perfectly silent, letting her toxic words hang in the air. My silence only fueled her irritation. She continued her tirade, demanding my presence at a mandatory family dinner tomorrow evening at their exclusive country club. She informed me that the entire family would be seated at the VIP table in the main dining room at 7 o'clock sharp. "Brittany has a huge announcement to make," Patricia insisted, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "It is incredibly important for her new lifestyle brand and her future with Kevin. You are going to be there, you are going to dress appropriately for once in your life, and you are going to smile." Before the main course arrives, you will stand up and apologize to your sister and your father for ruining the mood tonight. You owe them that much respect after everything they have done for you." I stared at the monitors displaying the digital evidence of her massive theft. She wanted me to apologize. She wanted me to beg for forgiveness from the people who had stolen my home and drained my $4 million trust fund. I kept my voice deadpan, completely stripped of any emotion. I told her I understood the instructions. I told her I would absolutely be there tomorrow night. I said I would not miss Brittany's huge announcement for the world. Patricia let out a sharp sigh of approval, muttered something about me finally showing some maturity, and told me not to be late. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, waiting for her to disconnect. But before Patricia could hang up, the main monitor in the center of my workstation flashed a blinding, pulsing crimson warning. The room was bathed in red light. A high-pitched alarm echoed from my encrypted speakers. "Intrusion alert!" A massive, aggressive brute force data breach attempt was hammering against the outer firewalls of Sentinel Vanguard's highly classified corporate servers. Someone was launching a coordinated high-level attack, trying to crack into my company's main client database. My fingers slammed onto the keyboard, instantly initiating my active defense protocols. I ran a rapid, aggressive trace on the true origin IP address. The geographic location pinged on my digital map, narrowing down from the state of Illinois to the city of Chicago, and finally zooming in on a very specific suburban neighborhood. The system pulled the exact MAC address and the device registry information. I stared at the results flashing on the screen, a cold smile slowly spreading across my face. The attack was originating directly from my old suburban address. The registered device was a high-end gaming laptop. It was Kevin's laptop. My husband, sitting in the living room of the house he had just stolen from me, was actively trying to hack into my servers. He was trying to hack me. I stared at the glowing zero balance until the digits burned themselves into my retinas. $4 million, a fortune, meant to guarantee my independence and future, had completely vanished into thin air. I did not scream. I did not shatter the expensive monitors surrounding my desk. I simply routed my forensic tracking software directly into the trust fund's historical ledger, commanding the system to unearth every single withdrawal, every wire transfer, and every cleared check over the past 14 years. The screen flooded with cascading lines of financial data. I isolated the primary recipient account, receiving the largest, most frequent disbursements. The routing number belonged to a private elite wealth management bank located in downtown Chicago. The account holder name flashed on my screen in bright white letters. It was Patricia, my mother. The exact date of the very first massive withdrawal hit me like a physical strike. It was processed exactly 2 days after my 18th birthday. A sharp, fast-paced memory ripped through my mind, playing out with brutal, sickening clarity. I was standing in the immaculate kitchen of my childhood home, clutching a stack of college brochures. Patricia was tapping her manicured fingernails against the granite island, her face pulled into a tight frown of supreme impatience. She demanded my Social Security card and my newly issued state driver's license. She shoved a thick, dense stack of legal documents across the counter, completely covering the financial details, with her hands exposing only the bottom signature lines. She told me it was for my college financial aid applications. She said I needed to sign them immediately because the federal deadlines were closing. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and said I did not want to be a financial burden on my poor father, and I needed to sign the papers to secure my student loans so I could pay my own way. I signed them instantly. I handed over my identification, desperate to please her, desperate to prove I was a responsible, grateful daughter. Patricia had never applied for financial aid on my behalf. I had paid for every single credit hour of my undergraduate and master's degrees by working graveyard shifts at a diner and running campus tech support until my hands cramped. Patricia had used my Social Security number and my signature to completely forge my identity. She had legally appointed herself the sole proxy and beneficiary manager of my grandfather's trust. Over the next decade, she systematically bled my safety net completely dry. She stole my future to fund Brittany's lavish European vacations, her custom designer wardrobes, and her endless string of failed, expensive startup hobbies. She used my inheritance to pay for her exclusive country club memberships and the brand new luxury vehicles she paraded around the neighborhood. My mother had looked me in the eye, called me a financial burden, and then robbed me blind to spoil the sister who despised me. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal settled heavily over my shoulders. My husband, my father, my mother, and my sister. They were all parasites feeding off my hard work and my stolen legacy. I felt the last lingering shred of familial loyalty burn away into ash, leaving behind nothing but cold, calculating rage. I turned my attention back to the 6 monitors illuminating my face. I was not going to hire a standard divorce attorney and fight over a stolen house. I was going to use my digital arsenal to systematically dismantle their reality piece by piece. I targeted Richard's hidden offshore accounts first. I used the proprietary infiltration tools I had personally built to track international cyber syndicates and dismantle financial terror networks. Richard thought his wealth was perfectly hidden behind impenetrable Swiss and Cayman Island banking firewalls. He thought his money laundering was secure. I sliced through his outdated security protocols in less than 12 minutes. I bypassed the dual authentication servers and planted myself directly inside the root directory of his master financial network. I could have drained the accounts entirely with a single keystroke. I could have transferred every stolen cent into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet right then and there. But that would be far too fast, far too merciful. If the money vanished tonight, they would panic and scramble to hide their remaining physical assets. I wanted them to feel entirely secure. I wanted them to believe they had won the war. Instead, I injected a highly sophisticated sleeper protocol into the core architecture of his banking network. It was a stealth lockdown sequence designed to mimic normal server activity until the exact moment of execution. The code spread through his accounts like a silent virus, wrapping itself around every administrative control without triggering a single alarm. I programmed a delayed absolute trigger. In exactly 7 days, at the precise moment Richard usually logged in to review his morning portfolio, the sleeper protocol would activate. It would simultaneously freeze every single account tied to his name, his firm, and his numerous shell companies. It would lock down his credit lines, cancel his wire privileges, revoke his firm's trading licenses, and automatically forward a comprehensive, undeletable ledger of his embezzlement activities directly to the Fraud Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For the next week, Richard and Patricia would continue living their luxurious stolen lives, completely oblivious to the digital time bomb ticking down under their feet. They would sleep soundly before losing absolutely everything. The harsh vibration of my burner phone shattered the quiet hum of the server room. I glanced at the glowing screen resting on my mahogany desk. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, masking my righteous anger behind a wall of absolute detachment. I picked up the device and pressed answer. Patricia did not bother with a greeting. Her voice was shrill, dripping with condescension and aggressive authority. "You made a complete fool of yourself tonight, Vanessa," she snapped, "leaving your own graduation party like a petulant child. It was highly embarrassing for your father and me. We had to tell our important guests you were feeling unwell just to cover up your dramatic little exit. You always find a way to ruin a perfectly good evening with your terrible attitude." I remained perfectly silent, letting her toxic words hang in the air. My silence only fueled her irritation. She continued her tirade, demanding my presence at a mandatory family dinner tomorrow evening at their exclusive country club. She informed me that the entire family would be seated at the VIP table in the main dining room at 7 o'clock sharp. "Brittany has a huge announcement to make," Patricia insisted, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "It is incredibly important for her new lifestyle brand and her future with Kevin. You are going to be there, you are going to dress appropriately for once in your life, and you are going to smile. Before the main course arrives, you will stand up and apologize to your sister and your father for ruining the mood tonight. You will tell them you are grateful for everything they have provided. You owe them that much respect after everything they have done for you. I stared at the monitors displaying the digital evidence of her massive theft. She wanted me to apologize. She wanted me to beg for forgiveness from the people who had stolen my home and drained my $4 million trust fund. I kept my voice deadpan, completely stripped of any emotion. I told her I understood the instructions perfectly. I told her I would absolutely be there tomorrow night. I said I would not miss Brittany's huge announcement for the world. Patricia let out a sharp sigh of approval, muttered something about me finally showing some maturity, and told me not to be late. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, waiting for her to disconnect. But before Patricia could hang up, the main monitor in the center of my workstation flashed a blinding, pulsing crimson warning. The room was bathed in red light. A high-pitched alarm echoed from my encrypted speakers. Intrusion alert! A massive, aggressive, brute-force data breach attempt was hammering against the outer firewalls of Sentinel Vanguard's highly classified corporate servers. Someone was launching a coordinated high-level attack, trying to crack into my company's main client database. My fingers slammed onto the keyboard, instantly initiating my active defense protocols. I ran a rapid, aggressive trace on the true origin IP address. The geographic location pinged on my digital map, narrowing down from the state of Illinois to the city of Chicago, and finally zooming in on a very specific suburban neighborhood. The system pulled the exact MAC address and the device registry information. I stared at the results flashing on the screen, a cold smile slowly spreading across my face. The attack was originating directly from my old suburban address. The registered device was a high-end gaming laptop. It was Kevin's laptop. My husband, sitting in the living room of the house he had just stolen from me, was actively trying to hack into my servers. The man who had called me a pathetic mid-level IT desk worker was arrogantly trying to hack the CEO of the most secure digital fortress in the country. He was trying to hack me. I left the opulent dining room of the Oakwood Country Club with their greedy, arrogant smiles burned permanently into my memory. They genuinely thought they had broken my spirit. They sat around that pristine white tablecloth swirling expensive scotch and believed I was going to willingly hand over my entire consulting company and take out a massive, crippling personal loan just to fund their pathetic charade. I drove back to my downtown Chicago penthouse in total silence, the manufactured facade of the weeping, defeated sister melting away the very second I stepped out of my car. I walked into the grand lobby of my building, nodding politely to the night staff, and stepped into my private elevator. The heavy oak doors slid shut, sealing me inside my true domain. The air in my penthouse was cool and sterile, humming with the faint electric pulse of enterprise-grade server racks hidden securely behind the acoustic panels of my living room walls. I did not even bother changing out of the shapeless drab gray dress I had worn to play my part. I walked directly to my custom-built mahogany desk, pressing my palm firmly against the biometric scanner. The surface hummed to life, and 6 massive high-resolution monitors rose silently from the casing. It was time to dissect the golden child. I initiated a full-spectrum cyber audit, focusing the entire processing power of Sentinel Vanguard's mainframe directly onto Brittany's highly publicized luxury lifestyle brand. My younger sister had spent the last 2 agonizing years bragging about her explosive success as a brilliant entrepreneur, flaunting her sudden wealth on social media, giving interviews to local magazines, and claiming she was single-handedly building a corporate empire from the ground up. I launched a deep-dive packet sniffer into her corporate network, bypassing her amateur off-the-shelf firewalls in less than 3 seconds. I aggressively ripped through her supply chain manifests, her vendor contracts, her employee payroll records, and her shipping logistics. I stared at the cascading streams of illuminated data, a cold, hard truth materializing across my screens. Brittany's company was a total ghost. Through rapid, relentless data tracing, I uncovered that her glamorous lifestyle brand produced absolutely 0 physical products. There were no manufacturing plants, no warehouse inventories, no shipping manifests, and no legitimate retail distributors anywhere in the country. It was an elaborate, beautifully decorated shell company designed solely for Instagram photos and high society bragging rights. I dug much deeper, slicing through thick layers of encrypted financial routing to find the true source of her capital. The money flowing so freely into Brittany's corporate accounts was not coming from retail sales or wealthy, eager clients. It was a direct, heavily automated digital pipeline connected straight to Richard's prestigious investment firm. My father was using Brittany's fake glamorous company exclusively to launder the millions of dollars he was actively embezzling from his own clients' corporate pension funds. They were washing stolen retirement money through fake inventory purchases, inflated consulting fees, and phantom marketing expenses. My sister was the smiling, heavily filtered face of a massive, coordinated federal crime, and my father was the architect moving the stolen pieces behind the curtain. They were stealing from the elderly to fund their caviar and champagne lifestyle. While I was downloading the complete unredacted ledger of their money laundering operation, a secondary monitor on my far right flashed a brilliant pulsing red. My internal network intrusion detection system caught a highly suspicious outbound transmission attempting to aggressively breach my corporate firewall. I isolated the rogue data packet, instantly freezing it in digital amber. It was an encrypted email originating directly from Brittany's personal server sent straight to Kevin's private IP address, back at the suburban house. I cracked the weak encryption key effortlessly and opened the message. Brittany was frantic, her words spilling out in a panicked, demanding tone. She was commanding Kevin to immediately deploy the malicious software script he had purchased on the dark web earlier that week. She was ordering my husband to aggressively hack into my employer's network, demanding he steal the highly classified multi-million-dollar client list from the servers. Brittany wrote that once they possessed the proprietary client list, they could easily sell it to corporate rivals on the black market and use the massive cash payout to cover the crippling debts her fake shell company was rapidly accumulating. She was entirely unaware that I did not just work at the company in a mid-level IT position. She had absolutely no idea that I was the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole undisputed owner of Sentinel Vanguard. My own sister was commanding my treacherous husband to launch a targeted cyber attack against a fortified military-grade cybersecurity firm. They were completely blind to the fact that they were declaring war on a ghost they could not possibly defeat, attacking the very architect of the systems they were trying to breach. The sheer blinding arrogance of their desperate plan was almost comical. Kevin, a man who consistently struggled to troubleshoot his own home wireless router, a man who used to pretend to listen to my stories about network security just to feign interest in my life, was actually preparing to launch a brute force malware attack against server architecture designed to withstand state-sponsored digital terrorism. I did not block his clumsy entry. I decided to open the front door wide and cordially invite him inside. I typed a rapid sequence of commands, spinning up an isolated, heavily monitored sandbox environment entirely segregated from my actual corporate network. I meticulously customized the digital sandbox to look exactly like a vulnerable, unpatched administrative directory containing highly sensitive company files. I sat back and watched the live feed as Kevin's incredibly loud, amateurish malware script tripped every single silent alarm in my system. He smashed blindly into the decoy server, completely oblivious to the fact that I was tracking his every keystroke in real time. I allowed him to think he was a technological genius. I allowed him to believe he was successfully bypassing my elite security protocols and stealing restricted, highly classified data. But I was not feeding him a valuable client list. I was actively feeding him hundreds of gigabytes of fabricated, heavily encrypted financial records. I had meticulously engineered the fake documents to leave a blazing, undeniable digital trail that no forensic accountant could ever miss. Every single file he eagerly downloaded directly linked his personal IP address and Richard's primary corporate IP address to a massive ongoing international wire fraud syndicate. Kevin was sitting comfortably in the living room of the beautiful house he had just stolen from me, furiously downloading the exact digital evidence the federal government would need to lock him and my father in a maximum security penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. He genuinely thought he was stealing a fortune to impress his pregnant fiancée. He was actually weaving his own digital noose, tying the knot tighter with every single megabyte he transferred. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, sipping a glass of iced water, watching the progress bar on Kevin's download hit 100%. He severed the connection immediately, fleeing the decoy server like a terrified thief in the night, leaving behind a digital footprint so massive it could be seen from orbit. I smiled, a cold, sharp expression of absolute, unadulterated victory. I had them exactly where I wanted them. The trap was sprung, the bait was taken, and the cage door was permanently locked. I reached for my encrypted phone resting on the desk, preparing to alert my trusted contact at the Federal Cybercrimes Division to authorize the massive data drop. But before my fingers could even touch the sleek glass screen, the secure, hardwired communications line on my desk chimed a sharp, incredibly urgent tone. The sudden noise shattered the absolute silence of the penthouse. I pressed the flashing silver button, my eyes narrowing. The building concierge's voice echoed through the speaker, tight with absolute panic and breathless apology. He informed me that my mother, Patricia, had completely ignored his strict protests. She had aggressively bypassed the lobby security desk, threatening to have him fired, and was currently riding the private secure elevator directly up to my penthouse floor. I stood motionless in the center of my penthouse as the private elevator doors slid open. Patricia marched out, feigning maternal concern, before quickly dropping the act to deliver a vicious monologue about my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. While she paced the room, threatening to have me committed to a psychiatric ward, if I ruined Brittany's gala, I watched her subtly slip a cheap keystroke logger into my hallway router. I did not panic. I simply let her leave immediately, reverse-engineered her pathetic spy device, and sent a crippling virus straight back to Richard's corporate servers. His frantic voicemails blaming my amateur IT skills for his network crash were already saved to my evidence drive. As the elevator doors closed behind her, my encrypted terminal chimed. It was my contact at the FBI Cybercrimes Division confirming they had received my anonymous data dump. They were ready to move. I spent the entire day before the gala locked inside my command center, orchestrating the final catastrophic fall of my own family. The federal agents required absolute, undeniable proof before they could secure the arrest warrants, and I was going to hand it to them on a silver platter. I initiated a secure, heavily encrypted video conference with my primary liaison at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, alongside 3 senior investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They knew me only by my operational alias, completely unaware that the international money laundering syndicate they were currently investigating was orchestrated by my own father. I projected the entire financial map across the secure channel, illuminating their screens with the stark reality of the embezzlement ring. I provided the federal agents with the master decryption keys to Richard and Kevin's hidden offshore accounts. I walked them through the intricate maze of shell companies, pointing out the exact digital pathways where Richard siphoned millions from corporate pension funds. I showed the investigators exactly how the stolen capital was funneled directly into Brittany's fabricated luxury lifestyle brand, washed clean through fake inventory purchases, and then deposited into Kevin's private accounts. I handed them the routing numbers, the time-stamped wire transfers, and the forged vendor invoices. The SEC investigators were entirely silent, stunned by the sheer volume and meticulous detail of the evidence I was providing. I assured them that at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, the sleeper protocol I had injected into Richard's network would freeze the accounts, locking the stolen funds in place for federal seizure. The agents confirmed the strike time. The trap was set perfectly, coordinated down to the very millisecond. With the criminal investigation officially secured and the federal raid greenlit, I turned my attention to the civil execution. Richard and Patricia had demanded that I sign over full legal ownership of my limited liability company to Kevin as compensation for his supposed emotional distress. They wanted a public spectacle at the engagement gala. They wanted me to hand over the paperwork on a silver platter in front of their wealthy peers, cementing their dominance and my absolute submission. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I opened a blank legal document on my terminal and began to draft the transfer of ownership contract. I possessed a profound understanding of corporate liability law, and I wove that knowledge into every single paragraph. I drafted a seemingly standard ironclad transfer agreement, but buried deep within the complex, dense legal jargon was a highly customized assumption of liability clause. I camouflaged it perfectly beneath standard indemnification boilerplate text. By signing the document, Kevin was not just taking ownership of my small tech consulting hustle. The clause legally bound the acquiring party to automatically assume all existing debts, outstanding liabilities, and pending litigation associated with the specific routing numbers I had hard-coded into the appendix. I explicitly linked the LLC to Kevin's personal IP address, his social security number, and the exact offshore accounts he had used to conduct his wire fraud. I made sure the liability clause was irrevocable, waiving his right to any future arbitration or legal appeal. Once Kevin signed his name on the dotted line, he would legally claim ownership of a massive mountain of illicit debt. The LLC would instantly become a financial poison pill. By forcing me to sign over the company, they were legally forcing themselves to claim absolute ownership of their own federal crimes in writing. I reviewed the contract 3 times, ensuring the language was completely impenetrable to a standard corporate lawyer, but absolutely binding in a federal court. It was a masterpiece of legal sabotage. As I finished formatting the final page of the contract, my burner phone vibrated aggressively against the mahogany desk. I picked up the device and saw a new picture message from Kevin. I opened the text and stared at a photograph of my husband standing inside an exclusive high-end menswear boutique in downtown Chicago. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight black tuxedo, adjusting the silk lapels while holding a crystal glass of complimentary champagne. He had a smug, arrogant smirk plastered across his face, looking like a man who had just conquered the world. I did not need to guess how he paid for the $5,000 suit. My financial tracking software had already alerted me that morning. Kevin had illegally forged my signature to take out a massive second mortgage on the house he had stolen from me, draining the property's equity to fund his extravagant wardrobe for the engagement gala. He was celebrating his fake victory, using my stolen money, completely convinced of his own superior intellect. I read the caption attached to the photograph. It read, "Do not forget the paperwork tomorrow, loser. Try not to embarrass yourself when you hand it over." I stared at the message, feeling absolutely no anger, no sorrow, and no heartbreak. I felt nothing but a profound, chilling amusement. Kevin was a walking corpse parading around in a borrowed tuxedo. He was gloating over a victory that was mathematically impossible to achieve. He genuinely thought he had broken me, unaware that every step he took was guided by the strings I was pulling from the shadows. I did not reply to his pathetic taunt. I simply deleted the message and set the phone down on the desk. Let him enjoy his champagne. It would be the last drink he ever had as a free man. I sent the final transfer contract to the secure laser printer, humming quietly in the corner of the room. I listened to the crisp, heavy stock paper sliding through the machine, each printed page representing a definitive end to my old life. I gathered the warm documents, aligned the edges perfectly, and slid them into a sleek black leather presentation portfolio. I ran my hand over the smooth leather, feeling the satisfying weight of their impending destruction. I set the portfolio gently on my desk. The weapon was loaded. I walked away from the command center and stepped into my massive, brightly lit walk-in closet. I bypassed the entire section of faded gray dresses, oversized sweaters, and shapeless slacks I had used for years to maintain my pathetic disguise. I walked to the very back of the closet and unzipped a long protective garment bag. I pulled out a breathtaking custom-tailored crimson evening gown. The fabric was heavy silk designed to drape flawlessly against my frame, radiating absolute power and unapologetic dominance. It was a dress meant to command a room, a dress meant to draw every eye and silence every critic. I slipped the gown on the cool silk sliding over my skin. I paired the gown with a pair of stiletto heels that echoed the same dangerous shade of red. I stepped in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror. I applied a bold, dark red lipstick and brushed my hair back into a sleek, commanding style that highlighted the sharp angles of my face. I fastened a pair of diamond earrings that cost more than Kevin's entire forged mortgage. I stared at my reflection in the glass. The drab, terrified, submissive mouse they had abused for years was completely gone. The scapegoat they had mocked, manipulated, and stolen from was dead. The executioner was ready. The drive to the Astor Hotel Grand Ballroom took exactly 20 minutes. I sat in the back of my hired town car watching the Chicago skyline reflect against the tinted windows. The cool leather of the presentation portfolio rested heavily on my lap. When the vehicle pulled up to the grand entrance, the valet opened the door and I stepped out into the crisp evening air. The historic ballroom was the crown jewel of the city, a sprawling monument to old money and high society. Towering marble columns flanked the entryway, and a fleet of luxury vehicles was already lined up along the curb. I walked up the crimson-carpeted steps and handed my coat to the attendant. As I crossed the threshold into the main foyer, the sheer volume of the gathering washed over me. Over 300 guests filled the cavernous space. I recognized state politicians, billionaire tech investors, and the city's most elite socialites mingling under the massive crystal chandeliers. They were sipping imported champagne and eating beluga caviar, completely ignorant of the fact that the lavish spectacle around them was entirely funded by stolen retirement accounts. I stepped fully into the light, and the reaction was instantaneous. The crimson silk gown draped flawlessly against my frame, moving like liquid fire with every step I took. The sharp, commanding cut of the fabric and the glittering diamond earrings caught the ambient light, transforming me from the invisible, pathetic spinster into a commanding presence. Heads turned immediately. Conversations halted mid-sentence. I saw the confused, stunned expressions of my parents' wealthy friends who had spent years ignoring my existence. They stared at the bold, dark red lipstick and the unapologetic confidence radiating from my posture. For the first time in my entire life, I was not shrinking into the background. I was daring them to look at me. I did not have to wait long for the orchestrators of this charade to notice my arrival. Before I could even reach the edge of the main ballroom, a heavy, aggressive hand clamped down brutally hard on my bare upper arm. I did not flinch. I turned my head slowly to find my father standing right beside me. Richard's face was flushed with anger, his grip tightening like a steel vice, his expensive cologne mixing with the sharp scent of scotch on his breath. Patricia stood directly behind him, her eyes wide with shock and fury as she took in my appearance. She had expected me to arrive in another shapeless gray sack ready to hang my head in shame. Richard leaned in close, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper intended only for my ears. He demanded to know what the hell I thought I was wearing. He said I was intentionally trying to draw attention away from my sister on her special night. His fingers dug painfully into my skin as he reminded me of the consequences of disobedience. He told me to hand over the legal documents, quietly, keep my mouth completely shut, and go find my assigned seat at the very back of the room, right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. He hissed that I was a guest here purely on his generous mercy, and I would do well to remain entirely invisible. Before I could reply, Brittany glided through the crowd toward us. She was wearing an obnoxiously extravagant white gown covered in imported lace, looking every bit the radiant, wealthy bride-to-be. She stopped in front of me, her eyes sweeping up and down my crimson dress with pure, unfiltered malice. She immediately placed her hand on her slightly swollen stomach, rubbing her pregnant belly in a highly performative gesture designed to draw the eyes of the surrounding guests. She elevated the volume of her voice, ensuring the nearby socialites and investors could hear every single word. She asked me where I had managed to find such a cheap, trashy knockoff. She laughed a high, grating laugh and said the bright red color made me look incredibly desperate for attention, adding that polyester was highly flammable and I should stay away from the catering candles. Patricia quickly chimed in, placing a reassuring hand on Brittany's shoulder while glaring at me. She apologized loudly to the surrounding guests for my supposedly erratic behavior. I maintained absolute, terrifying composure. I did not break eye contact with my sister. I did not defend my dress. I simply smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile, patted the black leather portfolio tucked tightly under my arm, and told Brittany that I brought exactly what they asked for. I told Richard I would gladly take my seat in the back and wait for my cue. I pulled my arm firmly out of his aggressive grip, turned my back on my stunned family, and walked directly toward the kitchen doors. I sat at a tiny, poorly decorated table in the shadows, sipping a glass of sparkling water, watching the apex predators of Chicago society feast on stolen wealth. The gala proceeded with sickening opulence. The multi-course dinner was served on gold-rimmed china. A 12-piece orchestra played classical music from a raised balcony. I watched Kevin circulating through the room in his $5,000 stolen tuxedo, shaking hands with aldermen and clinking glasses with corporate executives. He looked so incredibly proud of himself. He genuinely believed he had hacked my servers, stolen a fortune, and secured his place among the city's financial elite. He had absolutely no idea that the digital noose was already pulled tight around his neck. As the dessert plates were cleared away by the waitstaff, the orchestra music faded into silence. A spotlight snapped on, illuminating the grand stage at the front of the ballroom. Richard walked up the carpeted steps, adjusting his suit jacket, projecting the absolute image of a powerful, benevolent patriarch. The crowd applauded respectfully as he stepped up to the microphone. He tapped the microphone stand, his booming voice echoing across the massive room. He delivered a sickeningly pompous, deeply arrogant speech. Richard boasted about his long-storied legacy in the financial sector. He talked about integrity, hard work, and the importance of family values. I sat in the shadows listening to a man who was actively embezzling millions from the elderly lecture a room full of millionaires about corporate morality. He swept his hand toward the front VIP table, demanding a round of applause for his beautiful daughter Brittany. He spoke about her brilliant new lifestyle brand, praising her entrepreneurial spirit. He then turned his attention to Kevin. Richard called Kevin the son he never had. He praised Kevin's sharp mind and declared that bringing Kevin into the family business was the greatest investment he had ever made. The crowd cheered. Kevin stood up, waving to the audience, soaking in the unearned adoration. Richard held up his hands, asking for quiet. His tone shifted, becoming dripping with faux magnanimity. He told the audience that family was about forgiveness and bringing the lost sheep back into the fold. He announced that his eldest daughter, Vanessa, had struggled for years to find her path, but tonight she was taking a massive step toward maturity. Richard called my name. He demanded I come up to the stage to present my wedding gift to the happy couple and offer my public blessing for their union. The spotlight swiveled violently across the room, cutting through the darkness and landing directly on my table by the kitchen doors. 300 wealthy guests turned in their chairs to stare at me. I stood up slowly. I picked up the black leather portfolio. The room fell into a deafening silence as I walked down the long center aisle. My stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. The crimson silk gown moved around me like a storm. I did not look at the floor. I kept my head held high, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. I ascended the stairs to the stage. Richard stepped back, yielding the center of the stage, a smug, victorious sneer plastered across his face. Brittany and Kevin walked up the opposite stairs to meet me. They stood shoulder to shoulder, bathed in the bright spotlight. Kevin reached his hand out, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. I stopped directly in front of him. I raised the sleek leather portfolio and pressed it firmly into his waiting hands. I watched his fingers close around the documents. By physically accepting that folder, he was embracing the poison pill. He was taking ownership of the LLC, the fraudulent debt, and the federal liability. Kevin leaned in close, his lips brushing near my ear. He whispered that I was a pathetic, weak loser, and he owned me now. He pulled back his smirk, widening into a full triumphant grin. He grabbed the microphone from the stand, turning to face the massive audience, preparing to deliver the final crushing public humiliation they had meticulously planned for me. I did not step away. I reached my right hand into my small evening clutch. My fingers wrapped around the smooth plastic of a small custom-built remote control. I looked directly into my father's eyes, then at my sister, and finally at my husband. The executioner was ready. I pulled the remote from my clutch and pressed the single red button. The single button on the remote depressed with a satisfying tactile click. Instantly, the syrupy, romantic acoustic music that had been playing over the ballroom's massive surround sound system cut out, replaced by a sharp, deafening screech of audio feedback that made several socialites in the front row cover their ears. The towering projector screens mounted behind the stage, which were currently displaying a looped, soft-focus montage of Brittany and Kevin's overly stylized engagement photos, suddenly flickered violently. The images of their fake manufactured happiness died, leaving the screens pitch black for one agonizing second. Then a blinding, stark white light flooded the stage as the new display initialized. The first high-resolution scan snapped onto the screens projected 30 feet high and perfectly crisp. It was a legal mortgage document bearing the official seal of the bank and the undeniable signature lines at the bottom. I turned slowly, my crimson gown sweeping the floor, and looked at Kevin. His hand still gripping the microphone he had planned to use to destroy me dropped to his side. His mouth fell open, his eyes tracking the massive letters projected above him. I stepped into his personal space, my movements fluid and unhurried, and smoothly slipped the microphone directly out of his paralyzed fingers. I turned my back to my treacherous husband, facing the sea of 300 elite guests. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the cavernous ballroom, stripped of any warmth, any hesitation, and any mercy. It was the cold, surgical tone of an executioner reading a verdict. I directed the crowd's attention to the screens behind me. I narrated the document with absolute precision. I explained that they were currently looking at a secondary mortgage application filed against my personal property, a house that I solely owned. I pointed out the digital timestamp, the associated IP address matching the suburban home network, and finally the blatant amateurish forgery of my signature at the bottom of the page. I let the weight of the felony sink into the room before I delivered the context. I informed the hushed crowd that the man standing behind me, the brilliant future son-in-law my father had just spent 10 minutes praising, had illegally drained the equity from my home to fund his own engagement. I explicitly stated that the massive diamond ring currently sitting on my sister's finger was purchased with stolen funds. I gestured dismissively over my shoulder toward Kevin, highlighting the fact that the $5,000 custom tuxedo he was currently wearing was paid for by a fraudulent loan he took out in my name. The gasps from the audience were immediate and audible. The wealthy elite, who despised nothing more than a cheap grifter, immediately began whispering among themselves. The glittering facade of Brittany and Kevin's perfect romance shattered instantly. Before the crowd could fully process the reality of Kevin's pathetic theft, I pressed the button on my remote for the second time. The screen refreshed instantly. The mortgage application vanished, replaced by an expansive, highly detailed collage of financial withdrawal slips, wire transfer receipts, and certified bank checks. The logos of several exclusive high-wealth management firms were prominently displayed across the top of the documents. The payee on every single transaction was listed as Patricia Wilson. I kept my voice perfectly level, a stark contrast to the escalating tension in the room. I explained that these documents represented a 14-year timeline of systematic calculated theft. I told the crowd about the $4 million trust fund my grandfather had left entirely in my name, a safety net designed to protect my future. I guided their eyes to the forged proxy signatures, demonstrating exactly how Patricia had legally hijacked my identity when I was barely 18 years old. I listed the specific destinations of the stolen money, reading the routing numbers aloud. I explicitly detailed how my mother had drained my $4 million inheritance down to zero to pay for her exclusive country club memberships, her fleet of luxury vehicles, and Brittany's endless, lavish European vacations. I laid bare the absolute reality that their entire lifestyle was built on the financial corpse of their own daughter. Patricia snapped. The pristine, elegant mask of the high society matriarch dissolved into a visage of pure, unhinged panic. She leaped from her chair at the VIP table, her chair crashing violently backward onto the hardwood floor. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and frantic, commanding the hotel waitstaff to pull the plugs. She ordered the ballroom manager to cut the power to the stage and tear the projector cables directly out of the walls. Several technicians in black uniforms scrambled toward the audiovisual booth, situated at the back of the room, frantically tapping at their control boards. I watched their futile efforts with a cold, triumphant smile. They were completely locked out. I had spent the entire morning digitally fortifying the venue's network infrastructure. I had deployed a customized aggressive encryption protocol that completely hijacked the AV system's root access. There were no physical cables left to pull that would matter. The projectors were receiving a direct, unbreakable wireless feed from the secure servers, humming quietly in my downtown penthouse. Patricia could scream until her vocal cords bled, but she could not stop the truth from being broadcast. The evidence was immortalized in 30-foot high-definition, burning brightly against the dark walls of the ballroom. The panic in the room was palpable, but the main event had not even begun. I pressed the button on my remote for the third and final time. The ultimate checkmate materialized on the screens. The trust fund receipts disappeared, replaced by a massive, scrolling master ledger. It was a comprehensive map of international wire fraud, detailing offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, hidden Swiss banking directories, and a vast network of anonymous shell companies. The numbers on the screen were staggering, totaling in the tens of millions. But I did not just display the destination of the stolen funds. I displayed the source. I gripped the microphone tightly, my voice cutting through Patricia's ongoing shrieks. I announced that the final exhibit was not a personal family grievance. I explained that it was a direct, undeniable record of Richard Wilson's corporate embezzlement syndicate. I read the names of the victimized holding companies aloud. I read the names of the private investment portfolios. I read the names of the specific corporate pension funds that had been ruthlessly siphoned dry to fund Richard and Brittany's illegal money laundering operation. I did not need to guess how the crowd would react, because I was reading the names of the very people sitting in the ballroom. The elite politicians, the powerful corporate executives, and the billionaire socialites who had just applauded Richard's speech suddenly recognized their own firm's names flashing on the screen next to massive unauthorized withdrawal amounts. The realization dawned on them like a physical blow. The money was gone. Their investments were a lie. Richard had robbed them blind. The ballroom erupted into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The polite murmurs of high society vanished, replaced by explosive, visceral outrage. Investors shoved themselves away from their tables, their faces purple with fury. A prominent state senator whose campaign funds had apparently been tied into Richard's fraudulent accounts threw his crystal champagne flute against the wall, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. Wealthy men in expensive suits began shouting violently, demanding their money, screaming for the police, and pointing accusatory fingers directly at the stage. The elegant engagement gala had instantly devolved into a riot of betrayed billionaires. Richard stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his arrogant, pompous demeanor completely obliterated. The blood had drained from his face, leaving him a pale, trembling shell of a man. He stared at the 30-foot ledger, projecting his federal crimes to the entire world, fully comprehending that his life was over. He lunged forward desperately, trying to grab the microphone from my hand, to silence me, but two furious investors had already stormed the stage, blocking his path and shoving him backward by the lapels of his suit jacket. In the middle of the deafening uproar, the shouting and the sheer beautiful destruction of my family's legacy, I turned my attention back to my husband. Kevin had been standing paralyzed, his eyes darting frantically between the furious crowd, the damning evidence on the screens, and the absolute chaos unfolding around him. The reality of his impending federal arrest should have crushed him. The undeniable proof of his pathetic forged mortgage should have brought him to his knees. Instead, Kevin's fragile narcissistic ego violently rejected the reality of his defeat. He could not process the sheer magnitude of the humiliation, so he clung desperately to the only victory he believed he still possessed. He snapped out of his paralyzed state, a manic, desperate smile stretching across his face. He stepped forward, raising his arm high above his head, aggressively waving the black leather portfolio I had just handed him. He shouted at the top of his lungs, his voice straining to be heard over the furious rioting crowd. "You are done. I just signed the papers. I legally own your tech company now. You have nothing." A sharp, genuine laugh escaped my lips, cutting through the deafening uproar of the ballroom like a crack of thunder. The sheer, blinding audacity of his arrogance was almost beautiful in its profound stupidity. Kevin stood on the stage, triumphantly waving the black leather portfolio above his head, demanding the attention of the furious, panicking billionaires. He genuinely believed that by physically holding a stack of paper, he had conquered my world. I raised the microphone back to my mouth, my voice projecting crisp and cold over the high-fidelity sound system, instantly silencing the rioting crowd. I told Kevin he had always been tragically, pathetically bad at reading the fine print. I pressed the button on my remote one final time. The massive projector screens behind us shifted, displaying a blown-up high-resolution scan of the exact contract Kevin was currently clutching in his sweaty hand. I directed his attention and the attention of every single corporate investor in the room to the highlighted paragraph on page 14. I narrated the legal text with slow, deliberate articulation. I explained that the limited liability company Kevin had just so eagerly claimed legal ownership of was not my highly profitable technology firm. It was a dummy corporation, a completely hollow, fabricated shell entity I had registered exactly 48 hours ago. I had designed it to serve as a digital toxic waste dump. I watched the triumphant smirk melt off Kevin's face, replaced by a twitching, pale mask of utter confusion. I explained to the silent, breathless audience that the entity he now legally owned held absolutely zero assets, zero intellectual property, and zero revenue streams. Instead, through the highly specific, irrevocable assumption of liability clause he had just signed in front of 300 witnesses, the LLC absorbed exactly $10 million of Richard's bad illicit debt. I walked slowly across the stage, my crimson silk gown sweeping the floor, stopping inches away from my trembling husband. I lowered my voice, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable. I told him he did not just steal a worthless company. I explained that I had specifically linked the dummy corporation directly to the offshore accounts he and Richard used to launder the stolen pension funds. By signing that contract, Kevin legally indemnified me of any association with those accounts. He legally claimed absolute ownership of the stolen money. He legally assumed sole undisputed responsibility for a massive multi-million-dollar federal financial crime. He had not secured his future. He had just signed a legally binding, unappealable written confession to federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Kevin stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost intoxicating. His hands began to shake violently. He dropped the microphone, the heavy thud echoing through the ballroom as it hit the stage floor. He ripped open the leather portfolio, frantically flipping through the dense, complex legal pages, his eyes scanning the incredibly detailed liability clauses he had completely ignored in his desperate rush to humiliate me. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound, the crushing realization of his absolute ruin finally sinking into his thick skull. He had willingly tied the noose, stepped onto the trapdoor, and handed me the lever. A piercing, hysterical scream shattered the silence on the stage. Brittany lunged forward, her pristine white designer gown tangling around her legs. The carefully constructed facade of the glowing wealthy bride instantly evaporated, leaving behind a vicious cornered animal. She realized in a fraction of a second that her lavish lifestyle, her fake brand, and her stolen inheritance were completely gone. Her perfect future had just been incinerated, and she was legally chained to a broke impending felon. She did not direct her rage at me. She turned entirely on Kevin. Brittany screamed that he was an absolute pathetic idiot. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid to sign a legal document without reading it. Kevin stammered, raising his hands in a weak attempt to defend himself, trying to explain that Richard had assured them the paperwork was a simple transfer of assets. Brittany did not let him finish. She raised her hand and slapped him directly across the face with every ounce of strength in her body. The sharp, violent crack of her palm striking his cheek echoed loudly through the ballroom microphones. Kevin stumbled backward, clutching his face, looking at his pregnant fiancée with absolute shock. Brittany continued to scream, calling him a worthless failure, blaming him for destroying her life completely, ignoring the fact that she was actively complicit in the very crimes that were bringing them down. I turned away from their pathetic, collapsing relationship and faced the audience. The ballroom was completely silent. The elite crowd of politicians, socialites, and betrayed investors watching the spectacular implosion of the Wilson family with morbid, paralyzed fascination. It was time to deliver the final strike. It was time to completely annihilate the false narrative my parents had carefully curated for over a decade. I raised the microphone, looking directly out into the sea of stunned faces. I told them that for the last 14 years, Patricia and Richard Wilson had introduced me as their tragic disappointment. I explained that they had told their country club friends, their corporate partners, and their elite social circle that I was a struggling mid-level IT desk worker. They painted a picture of a pathetic, unambitious daughter to hide the fact that they had stolen my inheritance to fund their own delusions of grandeur. They desperately needed me to be a failure so they could justify their own staggering greed. I paused, letting the absolute truth of my words settle over the room. I stood tall, the crimson gown making me an undeniable commanding focal point. I told the crowd that my name was Vanessa Wilson. I announced that I was not a desk worker. I was the sole founder, chief architect, and chief executive officer of Sentinel Vanguard. A collective audible gasp rippled through the audience. The wealthy corporate executives and billionaire investors in the room instantly recognized the name. Sentinel Vanguard was not just a company. It was the premier military-grade cybersecurity and digital forensics firm in the state of Illinois. It was the very firm that half the corporations in that ballroom contracted to protect their proprietary data from international syndicates. The realization hit the crowd in a massive, overwhelming wave. The quiet, invisible daughter Richard had publicly mocked for years was actually the most powerful, influential technological force in the city. I did not let the momentum fade. I told the audience that I was the one who had personally initiated the forensic audit of Richard's fraudulent empire. I explained that I had used my proprietary infiltration algorithms to bypass his outdated, pathetic banking firewalls in less than 12 minutes. I tracked every single stolen penny, mapping the exact digital pathways he used to siphon their retirement funds into his offshore accounts. I audited every fake vendor invoice for Brittany's non-existent lifestyle brand, and I recorded every single illegal wire transfer Kevin attempted to execute. I looked directly down at my father, who was still standing paralyzed at the edge of the stage, surrounded by the furious investors who had just discovered he was robbing them blind. I told Richard that he thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was nothing more than an analog thief playing in a digital world he could not possibly comprehend. I built the cage. I locked the door, and I handed the key directly to the federal government. The heavy, suffocating silence in the ballroom was suddenly broken by a sound originating from the city streets below. It started as a faint wail, rapidly multiplying and escalating into a deafening, overlapping chorus of high-pitched sirens, cutting violently through the Chicago night. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the historic ballroom instantly illuminated. Blinding strobing flashes of red and blue police lights painted the elegant walls, washing over the crystal chandeliers and the terrified faces of the elite guests. The sirens grew impossibly loud, the sound of dozens of heavy vehicles slamming into park on the street directly outside the venue's grand entrance. The heavy ornate oak doors at the back of the ballroom burst open with a violent splintering crash. Richard Wilson's head snapped toward the entrance, the last remaining shred of his arrogant, untouchable facade shattered completely. He looked at the flashing lights, looked at the furious investors surrounding him, and looked at me, standing victorious on the stage. Absolute primal terror consumed him. He abandoned his hysterical wife, he abandoned his screaming pregnant daughter, and he turned his back on his ruined legacy. Richard scrambled away from the stage, sprinting in a blind panic toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, desperately aiming for the service exit in a cowardly, pathetic attempt to escape. He smashed his hands against the kitchen doors, throwing his weight forward to push them open, but his momentum was instantly halted. The doors swung back, revealing a solid wall of black tactical vests, heavily armored federal agents, and raised weapons completely blocking his only path to freedom. The federal raid teams poured into the ballroom, an overwhelming wave of black tactical gear slicing violently through the sea of terrified elites. The sharp, commanding barks of federal agents echoed off the soaring marble columns, ordering everyone to remain exactly where they stood. The sheer velocity of the raid paralyzed the room. Over 36 FBI agents, flanked by grim-faced SEC investigators in dark windbreakers, swarmed the perimeter, securing every possible exit and locking down the venue. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gaze as hard as flint, marched directly down the center aisle. The crowd parted for him instantly, stepping back and pulling their expensive gowns and tailored suits away from his path. He did not spare a single glance for the trembling billionaires or the weeping socialites. His eyes were locked entirely on the stage. Richard scrambled backward, his polished Italian leather shoes slipping against the pristine hardwood floor of the stage. He bumped into the discarded microphone stand, sending it clattering loudly into the front row of tables. He raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, his voice cracking as he tried to summon the commanding, arrogant tone that had defined his entire pathetic existence. He babbled incoherently about misunderstandings, about needing to call his corporate lawyers, about his prominent standing in the Chicago financial community. The lead agent did not slow his pace. He ascended the stage stairs in 3 massive strides, grabbed Richard by the collar of his bespoke suit, and slammed him roughly against the base of the massive projector screen. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists with a harsh metallic finality. The agent loudly read him his Miranda rights, his voice booming over the ambient panic of the room, explicitly stating the federal charges of corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and coordinated money laundering. Richard slumped forward against the agent's grip, the remaining fight draining completely out of him. He looked like a deflated hollow shell, the reality of decades in a federal penitentiary finally crushing his spine. While Richard was being physically restrained, 2 more federal agents aggressively flanked Kevin. The smug, victorious smirk had been completely wiped from his face the moment he realized what he had just signed, replaced now by absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked at the black leather portfolio still clutched in his trembling hands, the document that legally tied him to $10 million of fraudulent debt, and dropped it onto the floor as if the leather had suddenly caught fire. When the agents grabbed his arms, Kevin completely folded. He did not maintain even a singular shred of dignity. He dropped heavily to his knees, openly weeping, thick tears streaming down his face as he begged the officers to let him go. He shrieked that he was innocent, frantically pointing a trembling finger at Richard. Kevin sobbed that he had been manipulated, claiming my father had forced him into signing the documents and running the malware scripts against my company's servers. He threw his father-in-law completely under the bus in front of 300 witnesses, babbling hysterically about how Richard was the sole mastermind and he was just a pawn. His pathetic, cowardly cries fell on completely deaf ears. The agents hauled him forcefully to his feet, ignoring his blubbering pleas, and snapped the cuffs tightly around his wrists, locking his hands behind his back. Brittany watched her fiancé completely disintegrate before her eyes, but her own reckoning arrived just seconds later. A female federal agent stepped toward her holding up a federal arrest warrant bearing Brittany's name. Brittany recoiled, her face twisting into a hideous mask of pure, spoiled entitlement. When the agent reached out to take her arm, Brittany violently slapped the agent's hand away. She threw a massive, unhinged tantrum, stomping her expensive heels on the wooden stage. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice echoing across the silenced ballroom. She demanded to know if the agent had any idea who she was screaming, that she was a prominent lifestyle entrepreneur, an elite socialite, and a pregnant woman who demanded respect. The female agent was completely unimpressed by the theatrical display. She swiftly grabbed Brittany's arm, twisting it expertly behind her back, and pinned her face down against the stage floor. The agent loudly announced that Brittany was being placed under federal arrest for her direct role in operating a fraudulent shell company and actively conspiring to launder stolen corporate funds. Brittany thrashed wildly against the floorboards, her pristine white engagement gown tearing at the seams, her perfectly styled hair falling into a messy, sweaty tangle across her face. She shrieked for our parents to save her, kicking her legs in a futile display of resistance. The pampered golden child was finally facing the very first real consequence of her entire life, and she was entirely incapable of handling it. Down on the ballroom floor, Patricia witnessed the absolute annihilation of her family from the front row. The reality of the situation crashed down on her with the devastating force of a falling building. The millions of dollars she had stolen from my trust fund were completely gone. Her husband was a confirmed federal criminal being dragged away in chains. Her favorite daughter was pinned to the floor in handcuffs. And the 300 elite guests surrounding her, the very people whose approval she valued more than her own soul, had just learned that she and her husband had stolen their retirement funds to pay for their country club memberships and luxury cars. Patricia's legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, landing hard on her knees. Complete suffocating panic overtook her. She looked up at the circle of wealthy socialites, politicians, and corporate executives standing around the VIP tables. These were the women she played tennis with, the men she hosted at her lavish dinner parties, the elite circle she had sacrificed my entire future and sanity to impress. Patricia reached out her hands, shaking violently, and desperately grasped at the hem of a heavily beaded gown worn by a prominent senator's wife. She begged for help. She pleaded for someone to call the governor to vouch for their character, to advance them alone, to do absolutely anything to stop the nightmare unfolding on the stage. The response was absolute freezing silence. The senator's wife yanked her dress out of Patricia's grasping hands with a look of profound physical disgust, wiping her hands together as if Patricia had infected her. One by one, the wealthy elite physically turned their backs on my mother. They looked at her with pure, unfiltered contempt, their expressions radiating absolute revulsion. They were looking at a woman who had not only robbed them blind, but had brutally betrayed, gaslit, and stolen from her own flesh and blood to do it. Patricia crawled forward, reaching for a hedge fund manager she had known for a decade, begging for mercy, but the crowd simply stepped away, treating her like a diseased animal. She was completely isolated in the center of the massive room, surrounded by the shattered, smoking ruins of her fake stolen empire. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ragged, breathless sobs, realizing with agonizing clarity that she was utterly, permanently ruined. There would be no more country club memberships, no more luxury cars, no more elite galas, and no more friends. She was destined for absolute bankruptcy and total unrelenting social exile. I stood completely still in the center of the stage, my crimson silk gown untouched by the surrounding chaos. I watched the federal agents coordinate the removal of the prisoners with cold, calculating detachment. Richard was the first to be marched down the stairs. He kept his head down, staring blankly at his polished shoes, completely broken by the reality of his impending federal prison sentence. He did not look at me. Brittany followed, still crying and screaming obscenities at the agents dragging her feet as they forced her toward the shattered oak doors at the back of the ballroom. Then it was Kevin's turn. Two large agents hauled him forward, his arms secured tightly behind his back. His expensive stolen tuxedo was wrinkled and stained with his own terrified tears. As they dragged him past the spot where I stood, Kevin suddenly dug his heels into the floor, fighting the agents just long enough to turn his face toward me. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and wide with pathetic desperation. The arrogant, smug hacker who had mocked my intelligence just hours earlier was completely gone. He looked at my pristine crimson dress, the diamond earrings, and the cold, unyielding expression on my face. He finally realized the absolute magnitude of the wealth and power I commanded. He realized that the woman he had treated like a disposable desk worker was actually the apex predator of the digital world. He strained against the agent's heavy grip, his voice cracking as he looked directly into my eyes, abandoning any remaining shred of pride. He begged me to use my money to post his bail. He cried out that I had millions, that I owned Sentinel Vanguard, and that I could easily afford the best defense attorneys in the state to get him out of this mess. As the federal agents violently jerked him forward to continue the march toward the flashing police cruisers waiting outside, Kevin twisted his head back over his shoulder. His desperate, pathetic voice echoed through the silent, staring ballroom. "We're still married. You have to help me." The final rejection was a masterpiece of cold efficiency. I didn't rush. I didn't flinch. As the federal agents prepared to drag Kevin toward the exit, I stepped directly into his path. The flashing red and blue lights from the squad cars outside washed through the ballroom windows, casting harsh, alternating shadows across his terrified, tear-streaked face. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. He looked at me with a pathetic, desperate hope, genuinely believing that his sudden appeal to our fraudulent marriage would summon some hidden reservoir of mercy. I looked at the man who had stolen my money, mocked my career, and planned my absolute ruin. I raised my left hand between us. With slow, deliberate precision, I pinched the 3-carat diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band that sat on my finger. They had always felt heavy, a physical anchor to a life built entirely on manipulation and deceit. I pulled them off in one smooth motion. Kevin held out his hands instinctively, trying to receive them, but the heavy steel handcuffs restricted his movement, his palms bound tightly together. I hovered my hand over his constrained, trembling fingers and simply let go. The cold metal dropped directly into his handcuffed palm with a dull, hollow clink. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. Have a nice life." I turned my back on him for the absolute last time. I did not look at my father, who was currently being shoved into the back of an armored transport vehicle, his head bowed in defeat. I did not look at my sister, whose hysterical shrieks were finally muffled as the heavy doors of a squad car slammed shut. I did not look at my mother, who remained crumpled on the ballroom floor, a ruined, discarded socialite surrounded by the very people who now despised her. The sea of stunned billionaires and elite executives parted for me immediately, creating a wide, clear path to the exit. I walked out through the shattered front doors of the grand ballroom and stepped onto the street. The crisp Chicago night air hit my face clean and refreshing. The flashing police lights illuminated my path, washing over my crimson dress and casting me in a brilliant, victorious glow. For the first time in my entire life, I took a breath of true, uncompromised freedom. The subsequent weeks played out in a rapid, brutal sequence of absolute destruction for the Wilson family. The consequences of their staggering greed manifested not in quiet legal battles, but in loud, humiliating public spectacles. In a crowded federal courtroom, the crushing reality of their situation was delivered by the sharp, echoing strike of a judge's gavel. Richard stood before the bench in a bright orange county jumpsuit. His custom-tailored suits confiscated his silver hair, unkempt and wild. He looked 20 years older, a frail, defeated old man. Beside him stood Kevin, sobbing uncontrollably, his shoulders shaking as the federal prosecutor meticulously detailed the offshore accounts and the undeniable trail of digital evidence I had provided. The judge did not hesitate. Citing the massive scope of the international wire fraud and the blatant flight risks posed by their hidden offshore assets, bail was unequivocally denied. The heavy iron doors of the holding cell slammed shut behind them, locking them away until their federal trial. While the men were caged, the women of the Wilson family faced a different, equally devastating kind of imprisonment. Patricia's majestic fall from grace was swift and merciless. She pulled her luxury SUV up to the gilded iron gates of the Oak Brook Country Club, expecting to find solace among her wealthy peers. Instead, she found two stern security guards standing in front of her vehicle. The club manager stepped out holding a clipboard and coldly informed Patricia that her membership had been permanently revoked by an emergency vote of the board. She demanded to speak to her friends, naming the prominent socialites she had dined with just weeks prior. The manager simply turned his back and ordered the guards to escort her off the private property. The humiliation escalated immediately. When Patricia attempted to use her platinum credit cards to book a luxury hotel suite, the transactions were violently declined. The Internal Revenue Service, acting on the detailed financial ledgers I had broadcast to the world, executed a massive asset freeze. Every bank account, every investment portfolio, and every hidden safe deposit box was locked down tight. Federal agents descended on the sprawling suburban estate my parents had occupied for decades. They slapped neon foreclosure notices and government seizure warnings across the pristine front doors. Patricia and Brittany were given exactly 1 hour to gather whatever personal belongings they could carry in black plastic trash bags before being permanently evicted from the premises. With zero access to cash, zero credit, and absolutely zero friends willing to return their frantic phone calls, Patricia and Brittany were forced into the darkest, most pathetic corners of the city. The wealthy matriarch and the pampered pregnant socialite hauled their heavy trash bags into a tiny rundown motel on the outskirts of the industrial district. The neon vacancy sign outside their window flickered violently, casting a sickly green light over the stained carpets and peeling wallpaper of their cramped single room. Brittany sat on a sagging, lumpy mattress, crying hysterically over her ruined designer nails and her completely incinerated future. Patricia stood by the grimy window, staring blankly out at the highway, the crushing weight of her absolute financial and social ruin finally breaking her mind. But the legal avalanche I had triggered was not finished, because Kevin had signed that fraudulent liability clause, arrogantly claiming ownership of my dummy corporation. He had legally assumed sole responsibility for $10 million of bad debt. When the federal authorities seized his assets to begin paying back the defrauded investors they targeted, the only piece of property he officially had his name on, the suburban house he had illegally mortgaged to pay for Brittany's engagement ring. The bank moved with ruthless, terrifying speed. The foreclosure was absolute. The house was seized, cleared out, and immediately listed for public auction to satisfy the overwhelming debt Kevin had so eagerly signed up for. The county auction was held on a dreary, overcast Tuesday morning, directly on the front lawn of the foreclosed property. A small crowd of local real estate investors, contractors looking to flip a cheap house, and curious neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. Among the crowd stood Patricia and Brittany. They looked entirely out of place and profoundly pathetic. Brittany's pregnant belly was larger now, and the designer maternity clothes she wore were stained and unwashed, having been worn repeatedly for weeks. Patricia looked haggard, her posture hunched, her eyes darting nervously around the crowd. She clutched a thin manila folder tightly to her chest. In a final, desperate act of survival, Patricia had managed to scrape together a pitiful sum of money by pawning the last of her hidden jewelry and securing a predatory high-interest loan from a shady lender. She was hoping against hope that because the house was tied to a federal crime, the bidding would be low enough for her to buy it back for pennies. She desperately needed a roof over their heads, a way to escape the nightmare of the rundown motel. The auctioneer, a loud man with a clipboard and a booming voice, stepped onto the front porch and initiated the bidding. A few local contractors raised their hands, tossing out lowball offers, testing the waters. Patricia waited, her hands shaking, until the bidding began to slow. She raised her hand, her voice cracking as she called out a number. It was her absolute maximum limit. It represented every single cent she had managed to beg, borrow, and pawn. The auctioneer acknowledged her bid, calling it out to the small crowd, asking if anyone was willing to counter. Patricia turned to Brittany, a weak, desperate smile forming on her lips. She actually believed she was going to win. She believed she had salvaged one tiny piece of her ruined life. Then a sleek black armored town car pulled smoothly up to the curb. The low hum of the luxury engine drew the eyes of everyone on the lawn. The uniformed driver stepped out quickly and opened the rear door. I stepped out onto the pavement. I was not wearing the invisible, shapeless gray sweaters of my past. I was wearing a sharply tailored midnight black power suit that projected absolute authority and uncompromising wealth. My heels clicked sharply against the concrete walkway as I bypassed the crowd and walked directly to the front row. The murmurs of the local investors died down instantly. They recognized power when they saw it. Patricia and Brittany froze, their eyes widening in pure, unfiltered horror as they saw me approach. The auctioneer, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, cleared his throat and asked once more if there were any competing bids against Patricia's offer. I did not even look at the auctioneer. I kept my eyes locked dead onto my mother and my sister. I raised my hand. In a clear, commanding voice, I called out a number that instantly shattered Patricia's maximum limit. I tripled her bid in a single breath, adding casually that I would be paying the entire sum in cash immediately upon the close of the sale. The crowd gasped. The auctioneer quickly confirmed the bid, asking Patricia if she wished to counter. Patricia stood paralyzed, her mouth hanging open, tears welling in her exhausted eyes. She looked at the thin manila folder in her hands, realizing how utterly insignificant her efforts were. I had just outbid her entire life savings with what amounted to pocket change. I stood before them, the undisputed CEO, the woman they had mocked, robbed, and discarded. I smiled coldly as the auctioneer slammed his gavel down, shouting the final word that sealed their fate: sold. As the reality of their complete homelessness washed over them, Patricia and Brittany broke down openly, weeping on the sidewalk of the house they could no longer enter. I turned my back on them, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit, and walked back to my waiting car, leaving them to rot in the bed they had made. The air was crisp and biting the morning after the foreclosure auction. I did not move into the house. The sprawling suburban property with its manicured lawn, pristine white siding, and picturesque wraparound porch represented absolutely everything I despised. It was the physical manifestation of Kevin's betrayal, a monument to the counterfeit life my family had tried to force upon me. It was a structure built on stolen funds, forged signatures, and deep-seated lies. I stood at the end of the long, concrete driveway, holding a steaming cup of dark roast coffee, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal trench coat over my business attire. I had not brought a single moving box. I had not hired a decorator. Instead, I had contracted the premier commercial demolition crew in the tri-state area. 3 massive, heavy-duty yellow excavators idled loudly on the street, their deep diesel engines vibrating through the soles of my boots. A team of workers in high-visibility vests and hard hats moved efficiently around the perimeter of the property, securing the area and running final safety checks. The neighborhood was quiet, the surrounding wealthy suburbanites likely peering out from behind their drawn curtains, utterly bewildered by the heavy machinery parked in their exclusive cul-de-sac. I watched the foreman consult his clipboard, confirming the utility lines had been completely severed. He caught my eye and gave a sharp, definitive nod. We were ready to begin. Before I could give the final signal, a battered, faded blue sedan sputtered around the corner and pulled violently up to the curb. It was a cheap rideshare vehicle, a stark, humiliating downgrade from the imported luxury cars my family was accustomed to driving. The rear doors opened, and Patricia and Brittany stepped out onto the damp pavement. They looked completely and utterly destroyed. The rapid, brutal descent into poverty had stripped them of their polished high society armor overnight. Patricia's designer clothes were deeply wrinkled, her hair lay flat and unstyled, and the heavy bags under her eyes betrayed a sleepless night in that wretched, run-down motel. Brittany looked even worse. She dragged a black plastic trash bag out of the trunk, her shoulders slumped, the arrogant, entitled spark completely extinguished from her posture. They saw me standing at the end of the driveway and immediately rushed forward. They genuinely believed I was there to claim my prize to move into the house and gloat, but desperation had overridden their pride. Patricia swallowed hard, forcing a tight, trembling smile onto her face as she approached. She reached out her hands, shaking, and attempted to touch my arm. I took a deliberate step back, my expression an impenetrable mask of ice. Patricia's smile faltered, but she pressed on, her voice cracking as she begged. She pleaded for a place to stay. She completely abandoned any pretense of maternal authority, reducing herself to a pathetic, groveling shell. She asked if they could just use the guest room, promising they would stay out of my way, swearing that they just needed a few weeks to figure things out until Richard's legal mess was sorted. She actually tried to leverage our shared history, crying that a mother should never be left out on the street. Brittany immediately chimed in, dropping her heavy trash bag onto the driveway. She placed both hands protectively over her pregnant belly, using her unborn child as a weapon of guilt. She sobbed, demanding to know how I could be so heartless to leave my pregnant sister homeless. She whined about the motel smelling like mold, about her back aching, about how she deserved to be in a proper suburban home to raise her baby. They stood there, the apex predators of Chicago society, reduced to begging for scraps from the daughter they had spent a lifetime trying to destroy. I did not answer them. I did not offer a single word of comfort, justification, or anger. I simply turned my head toward the demolition foreman and raised my right hand. I dropped my hand in a swift, sharp motion. The foreman blew a loud whistle. The diesel engines roared to life, deafeningly loud. The largest excavator lurched forward, its massive metal treads chewing up the pristine green lawn. Patricia and Brittany screamed in shock, covering their ears and stumbling backward as the giant machine rolled directly past us. The operator manipulated the controls, raising the heavy hydraulic arm high into the air. With a brutal, terrifying force, the steel bucket smashed directly through the roof of the master bedroom. The sound of the destruction was magnificent. Wood splintered and snapped with the volume of gunfire. Shards of glass exploded outward, raining down onto the manicured flower beds. The excavator pulled back and swung again, tearing a massive gaping hole through the front facade of the house. Drywall insulation and shattered framing crashed to the ground in a billowing cloud of thick gray dust. The beautiful, pristine suburban dream home was being violently, systematically ripped apart. Patricia fell to her knees on the driveway, shrieking in pure, unadulterated horror. She clutched the sides of her head, tears streaming down her face as she watched the destruction. She screamed over the roar of the engines, demanding to know what I was doing. She asked why I would destroy a perfectly good multi-million-dollar home. She sobbed that it was a senseless, vicious waste of money, completely unable to comprehend a world where a physical asset was not worshipped. I looked down at her, completely unfazed by her hysterics. I stared at the collapsing rubble, at the dust swirling in the morning air, and I spoke with a voice that cut cleanly through the noise of the machinery. I told her I was destroying it because its foundation was rotten. I looked directly into Patricia's terrified eyes and told her that the house was just like this family, corrupt, unstable, and built entirely on lies. I explained that I was not tearing it down out of simple spite. I had already filed the necessary zoning permits with the city. I told them that once the debris was cleared, I was bringing in a commercial construction firm. I was transforming this exclusive, snobbish suburban lot into a state-of-the-art, entirely free coding academy for underprivileged girls. I was funding it directly through the charitable arm of Sentinel Vanguard. I wanted to build a place where brilliant young minds were actually nurtured, protected, and encouraged to grow. I wanted to create an environment where potential was celebrated, not mocked, stolen, and destroyed by the very people supposed to protect it. I was taking the physical space where Kevin had tried to build a fraudulent life and turning it into a fortress of genuine opportunity. Brittany's sorrow instantly curdled back into blinding rage. She lunged forward, her face turning dark red. She screamed that I was insane. She clutched her pregnant belly again, spitting venom as she demanded that I financially support her. She shrieked that we were blood, that I had a moral obligation to provide for her child, and that I could not just throw my money away on strangers while my own niece or nephew suffered in poverty. She demanded access to my bank accounts, insisting that family takes care of family. I maintained absolute terrifying composure. I did not raise my voice. I reached slowly inside the breast pocket of my trench coat and retrieved a single crisp white business card. I held it out toward her. Brittany snatched it from my fingers, her eyes scanning the text, expecting to see the name of a private wealth manager or a real estate agent. Instead, she read the name of a free state-funded legal aid clinic situated in the poorest district of the city. I looked Brittany dead in the eye and delivered the final crushing blow. I told her that she would never see a single dime of my money. I explained that sharing blood meant absolutely nothing without loyalty, and she had forfeited any right to that word a decade ago. I advised her to call the clinic if she needed help filing for government assistance because the bank of Vanessa Wilson was permanently, irrevocably closed. I turned my back on them. I did not wait for a response. I did not listen to Patricia's renewed wailing or Brittany's furious, helpless screaming. I walked down the driveway toward my waiting town car. As the driver opened the rear door for me, I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I opened my contacts list. I selected Patricia's number and hit block. I selected Brittany's number and hit block. I selected Richard's number and hit block. I deleted their contact profiles, completely purging them from my digital life just as thoroughly as I had purged them from my physical reality. I slid into the luxurious leather seat of the car, closed the door, and instructed the driver to take me to the office. The car pulled away smoothly, leaving the toxic remnants of my past choking on the dust of their demolished dream. 6 months later, the morning sun broke over Lake Michigan, painting the Chicago skyline in brilliant strokes of gold and amber. I stood in the massive open-concept living area of my downtown penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the city I had quietly conquered. The space was impeccably designed, filled with modern art, sleek furniture, and the quiet, pervasive hum of absolute security. I held a steaming mug of premium artisanal coffee, breathing in the rich aroma, feeling a profound, deep-seated peace that I had never known during my childhood. Sentinel Vanguard had gone public exactly 1 week prior. The initial public offering had been a massive, unmitigated success, blowing past all market projections and solidifying my firm as the undisputed leader in global cybersecurity infrastructure. My net worth had skyrocketed, securing my position not just as a wealthy woman, but as a titan of industry. The coding academy in the suburbs was thriving. The first class of 60 bright, ambitious girls had already begun their coursework in the newly constructed facility, learning the very skills that had saved my life. I had visited them yesterday, walking through the high-tech classrooms, watching their faces light up as they compiled their first programs. It was the proudest achievement of my entire career. I walked over to the kitchen island and tapped the remote, turning on the massive flat-screen television mounted against the far wall. The local morning news was running, the anchor's voice crisp and professional. The breaking news banner across the bottom of the screen caught my attention immediately. It was the sentencing phase of the highest-profile federal fraud case of the decade. The screen cut to footage outside the federal courthouse. I watched as Richard Wilson, shuffling and aged, was led out of the heavy glass doors wearing handcuffs and a prison uniform. He looked completely defeated, a broken man who had finally met a system he could not manipulate. Right behind him was Kevin. He was visibly weeping, his face pale and terrified, entirely unable to cope with the reality of his actions. The news anchor narrated the outcome with clinical precision. Richard and Kevin had both been found guilty on all counts of wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and money laundering. The federal judge, citing the staggering scale of the theft and the utter lack of remorse, had handed down consecutive 20-year sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There was no possibility of early parole. Their lives as free men were over. They would spend the next 2 decades locked in concrete cells, stripped of their names, their power, and their stolen wealth. I picked up the remote and clicked the television off. The screen went black, plunging the penthouse back into serene, comfortable silence. I walked back to the window and pressed my hand against the cool glass, looking down at the bustling, vibrant city below. A genuine radiant smile broke across my face. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations had been completely lifted. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the tragic disappointment forced to hide in the shadows. I was the absolute architect of my own life. I had built an empire from the ground up, turning the trauma of my past into the armor of my future. I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet, peaceful air of absolute freedom. The storm was finally over, the sky was clear, and the view from the top was simply spectacular. The story of Vanessa's ultimate triumph over her toxic family serves as a profound lesson in self-worth, resilience, and the true meaning of independence. Often we are conditioned to believe that we must endure mistreatment simply because it comes from our blood relatives. We are taught to be the silent scapegoat to maintain a fragile, artificial peace. However, this narrative shatters that illusion, proving that loyalty is earned, not automatically granted by genetics. Vanessa's journey teaches us that true power lies in quiet preparation and unwavering self-belief. While her family wasted their energy on superficial status, malicious schemes, and maintaining a facade of superiority, she poured her focus into building a tangible, unshakable foundation. Her success in the cybersecurity world was not just about accumulating wealth. It was about constructing an impenetrable shield against manipulation and control. Financial independence provided her with the ultimate freedom, the ability to walk away on her own terms and hold her abusers completely accountable. Furthermore, her decision to bulldoze the stolen property to create a free coding academy for underprivileged girls highlights a beautiful, redemptive truth. We have the extraordinary power to transform our deepest trauma into a profound source of healing and empowerment for others. By destroying a physical monument to her family's greed and replacing it with a sanctuary designed to nurture genuine potential, Vanessa proved that the absolute best revenge is creating a lasting legacy of positive impact. Share your stories of resilience in the comments below, especially if you have ever had to break free from toxic family expectations or stand up to someone who consistently underestimated your true worth. Please do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who needs a reminder that their independence is always truly worth the fight.